Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyungmun. I'm the co-chair of the 7th Anniversary Symposium of the Korean Church of Boston. Once again, thank you so much for those who are joining our symposium in person and virtually. Today, as the second day of the symposium, we will have two distinguished speakers this evening, Dr. Jane Hong and Dr. David Eunil. After each speaker's presentation, there will be a 10-minute Q&A session, so please hold your questions until then. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Jane Hong. At this time, please welcome Reverend Sam Ahn, who will introducing her.
It's my joy to introduce Jane Hong to you again and to repeat most of the things I have said for the sake of our online audience, many of whom might be listening for the first time. Professor Jane Hong is the professor of U.S. history at Occidental College. She is the author of Opening the Gates to Asia, a trans-Pacific history of how America repelled Asian exclusion. She is currently studying how post-1965 Asian migration, which she explained so articulately earlier today, is changing U.S. evangelical organizations and politics. She has studied history at Harvard for her PhD and has a BA from Yale University. As a child of immigrants and also as a student of history, I believe that she has seen things that many of us have seen, but has the ability to give to us things that we cannot access because we simply do not have the time. But let's thank God that she has done the studying for us, and join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you were able to get some rest today. I'm going to try to keep the energy up. I was not able to get some rest today, so I'm going to try to keep the adrenaline going. So today I'm going to speak about Korean American history. And I think for many folks, the first question is, there is Korean American history? But in fact, this history goes back more than 100 years, as many of us heard earlier today. And so I'm just going to talk about kind of some of the big events and some of the kind of big narratives that I think will help us contextualize Korean American communities, and also, if you are a Korean American, to contextualize yourself in this longer history. And here is some fun images from where I live in Southern California. Tosan An-chang-ho, independence freedom fighter, has a sign on the 10 freeway near Koreatown in Los Angeles. And on the bottom is the Pachapa camp, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. Let's see if this works this time. Thank you. Yes, okay. So this is, I actually went back after this morning's sessions and our conversation, which was really rich. I went back and I kind of changed some things up in my talk tonight. So I hadn't planned to talk about beef or these shows on Netflix, and I think for many folks, they're like, what is that? What is beef? So I don't know how many of you are on Twitter or social media generally, but it's actually, for academics in particular, and for me, it's been a really strangely supportive place for the kind of work that I'm trying to do. It's also where I've learned a lot about the contours of American religious history, and where I learn most of what I know about the major debates and issues within white evangelicalism and white Christian circles and within white church spaces. For younger historians, people will usually join Twitter a few years before their first books come out because your academic publishers tell you to. So that's what happened for me. I've had an account for a really, really long time, but I never really used it until my first book was about to come out, so about a few years ago. So on this slide, right, you have, there's this show on Netflix. It came out a few weeks ago, and it's generated a lot of discussion from the very beginning. And so recently, there have been some really interesting conversations generated by this show about Korean American history, and in particular, Korean American church history, Korean Americans, and the Protestant church. And I don't know if I would recommend this show, to be very honest. I'm only on episode 8. Like, I don't even know if I can finish it. It's extremely dark, it's extremely disturbing, and I mean, initially when it came out, a lot of TV critics declared it like one of the greatest shows because it defies genre, like you don't really know, is it a dark comedy, is it like a tragedy, like nobody actually knows. And there are also, in the past week, there's been a lot of discussion about the casting of David Cho, who's a Korean-American graphic artist who's in the show. There's a lot of questions about whether he should have been involved with this show. And so a lot of people are actually boycotting this show, a lot of folks I know. And this is all over the last week on Twitter, but elsewhere as well. So one of the scenes from episode 3 that generated really millions of people on Twitter, according to their stats anyway, millions of people on Twitter engaged with this video clip from episode 3. And in this episode, Stephen Yeun, he's a second-generation Korean-American in the show as well as in real life. He's worshiping at a Korean-American church, and he's singing a song by Elevation, that North Carolina-based band. So it's a white evangelical kind of organization. And he's having an emotional experience, kind of breaking down and crying in worship. And again, like people really went nuts over this scene. I mean, when I watched it, I was actually taken aback. Because, you know, if you look at this tweet here, this is one of the most viral tweets. It got viewed 6.8 million times. So, you know, the tweeter is talking about how like this scene actually accurately captures what kind of an evangelical Christian experience feels like, just for anyone who's ever had that kind of experience. And so people really, like I said, the conversation was like on fire. So people were retweeting, they were talking about their own experiences in the church. A lot of it was negative. There was a whole conversation thread about whether Christian worship is emotionally manipulative, kind of what purpose it serves. And really, this became a whole discussion on Twitter for days and days and days, and generated a bunch of, like NBC Asian America, CNN, all ran articles about it. So I found this whole series of tweets really fascinating, and I had watched up to episode 3 of the show. So I tweeted something to give some context on how important Protestant Christianity has been in shaping Korean American life and history. And it quickly became my most popular or viral tweet in like 5 years of being on Twitter. So 700,000 views. There was an incredible interest by a wide range of folks, not just Asian Americans, and not even all just Christians. And so, you know, in thinking about this tweet thread, I was struck by a few things. Oh, and by the way, so I talked about Stephen Yeun. So Stephen Yeun has talked about growing up in church and how that allowed him to connect to this character. And in a future episode of the show, he actually is leading worship at the front of the sanctuary. He sings Amazing Grace, Chris Tomlin version. Many of you probably know this. So I talked about Stephen Yeun. John Cho's dad was a pastor, and I was in a worship band with Lee Isaac Chung in college, because Sam and I went to college with Lee Isaac Chung, who made the movie Minari, based on his own experiences growing up in Arkansas. And so kind of this is where it started, but really the thread was just a bunch of history and statistics. So this whole experience reminded me of several things. First, it reminded me that, in fact, Korean Americans do actually have a history in the United States. But it also reminded me that this history is worth talking about, not just because white people on Twitter say it's important to talk about. It's actually worthwhile to talk about because it's our own history, and as has been suggested over the last day. If you don't know where you come from, if you don't know where your history is, if you don't know your own history, like how can you know where you're going, right? So there is that connection, because the past shapes our present, but it also has implications to shape our futures. So wouldn't you rather know where you're coming from? Wouldn't you rather understand your positionality? This whole tweet storm also reminded me of how perceptions of Korean Americans have been shifting in recent years because of Hollywood actors like Stephen Yeun, and before him, people like John Cho, and people like Lee Isaac Chung, who I think since Minari is now directing episodes of The Mandalorian on the Disney Channel, and is going to direct another movie called Twisters in the future. So these are folks who get reported on by The Hollywood Reporter, they get reported on by major media publications, and they're really kind of reshaping some of the conversation. Because the reality is, until more recently, you know, when I think about how Korean Americans are typically portrayed in mainstream media and even academic scholarship, It's either kind of as largely powerless victims of urban violence or as unwelcome exploiters and perpetrators of racism against Black and brown communities. That's what I've seen. I don't know what you have all seen. But I would argue that a closer look at history corrects these views. And here I have two main goals for my brief talk tonight. First, it's to give a big picture overview of Korean immigration to the US as a way of talking about the big contours of Korean American history. Because in fact, immigration continues to shape Korean America. And second, my goal is to argue that rather than being passive spectators or unwelcome bystanders who got caught in the crossfires of racial violence in 1992 and other moments, that Koreans have long organized and mobilized for a cause, from the first wave of Korean immigrants in 1903 to 1905 through the present. You know, before 1945, as many of you know, that cause was Korea's independence from Japan. During the late 1970s and 1980s, I have written about how Koreans fought for justice on behalf of a wrongly incarcerated young man named Chol-soo Lee. And third, after Saegu in 1992, how Korean immigrants responded to their communities' massive uninsured property losses and abandonment by the police by investing more deeply in US politics and society. And in drawing up this talk, let me say, I'm drawing from a chapter I wrote for the UCLA Asian American Pacific Islander digital textbook. So I was asked to write the textbook's chapter on Korean Americans back in 2021 when I was doing a fellowship at UCLA's Asian American Studies Center. Sitting down to write this chapter, I asked myself, what would I want my third generation Korean American daughter to learn in school about Korean Americans? Because the idea of this textbook, which has received support from the California state government, which is now part of kind of the ethnic studies standards, the whole goal of this textbook is for it to be used in high schools across California and eventually maybe the nation, as well as in colleges across California and again across the nation. And honestly, I'm from New Jersey. You know, there are states across the country that have actually passed mandates that require K-12 schools to teach Asian American history. I think so far it's Illinois, New Jersey, my home state, Connecticut, and there might be one other in addition to California. And so the idea that, you know, folks will actually study these histories in our schools is pretty amazing to think about. So a lot of this talk is drawn from that chapter. So first, a big overview, and I think some folks are familiar with this, but just in case, and also I think actually some folks might not be as familiar with this. So in terms of how scholars typically divide Korean immigration, they typically divide it into four main waves. So the first significant group of Korean immigrants, like I said, these are the folks who came to Hawaii, largely because of missionaries to South Korea. They came between 1903 to 1905, heavily Protestant. I don't know why my numbers have gone away, but it used to say 1, 2, 3, 4. The second wave followed the Korean War, so mostly women and children, military or GI brides, adoptees, as well as a few thousand students and more educated elites. Then you have post-65, skilled migrants and their family members, which I think probably includes a lot of folks in this room, if not the children of post-1965 immigrants. And then there's a post-1990 migration wave as well, which is really stratified in that it's both kind of wealthier migrants with more resources, but also a growing number of undocumented Koreans in the United States. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these groups. Oh, let me actually say first. In terms of kind of what we think of today, so more than 90% of Korean Americans today can trace their roots to an immigrant who arrived post-65 or post-1990. So in terms of most Korean Americans living in the United States, again, folks are not that distant or far removed from an immigration story, whether it's their own or their parents or their grandparents. And as I talked about this morning, prior to the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, the reason why so few Koreans were able to enter is because of race-based US immigration policies that were specifically designed to keep Asian immigration to the US minuscule. So that included Koreans, but also other Asians as well. So before 1965, fewer than 10,000 ethnic Koreans lived in the United States. Most of them were actually in Hawaii, and then a smaller population in California, and then in other states as well. And you know, as the whole beef Netflix show controversy and question and discussion reflects, from the very beginning, one of the key features of Korean American life was the ubiquity of Protestant Christianity. And I think many of us just know this from our own lives. Historically, Christians and Protestants in particular have been overrepresented in Korean migration to the United States. More so in the past than today, and but still, many Korean immigrants, whether they kind of become Christian in Korea or come to the U.S. and join churches and convert to Christianity, right? These kind of stories continue. And so one of the consequences is that more than half, and some scholars say between 60 to 70% of all Koreans in the United States have some kind of Protestant background, whether or not they want to, whether or not they would explicitly identify as Christian. And that was part of the thread that I did on Twitter as well. There's a tendency within kind of among scholars who study Korean America, there's actually a really interesting tendency in the secular academy to not talk about religion. And I think part of it has to do with people's own trauma dealing with the church, which I understand, but it actually distorts the literature, I think. So let's talk about the first wave first. What did this first wave of Korean immigrants look like? What did they experience? So I don't know how many of you have actually heard, have heard of Pachapa Camp? This was something, so this is a more recent discovery. Literally, I think 2021 is when you had New York Times, you had PBS do a whole series of clips about it. So the Pachapa Camp is it's nowadays called kind of America's first Koreatown. It's located in Riverside, California, so it's about 45 minutes an hour east of where I live in Los Angeles. And so this is a really interesting story. So the first Koreans who arrived in Hawaii between 1903 to 1905 through missionaries, particularly Presbyterian missionary Horace Allen, who we heard a lot about yesterday. So as I mentioned this morning, Allen brokered the deal between Hawaii plantation owners and Kim Ko-jong of Korea. And that was the deal that enabled Koreans to immigrate to Hawaiian islands as laborers. And so by 1905, about 7,200 26 Koreans had come to Hawaii. This included something like 1,000 women and children. So much smaller numbers, but still some women and children. So when the plantation labor contracts expired in Hawaii, about half of those Korean workers moved to the mainland of the United States, so primarily California. The other half of those workers generally returned to Korea. So Mary Paik Lee's family were among the ones who stayed and moved to California. She's on the right-hand side. That's her with one of her children and her husband. So Mary Paik Lee, I'll talk more about her in a minute. She's actually one of the earliest Korean immigrants that has written down her story in English. She's also one of the very few children. So she immigrated to Hawaii at the age of 5, which is incredibly young. And she lives from 1900 until 1995. So she lives for basically almost the entire 20th century. And so the book is actually really worth reading. I read it in college in an Asian American history class. She really starts the story with her family being baptized by Dr. Moffat in Northern Korea. And she talks about how her parents learned about the opportunity to go to Hawaii through missionaries, not Dr. Moffat, who was very skeptical about the emigration, but other missionaries that she came in contact with. And she talks about kind of, Japanese soldiers coming to her house in Korea and her family having to flee. So you really get a full sense of kind of what the conditions were on the ground in Korea that made people leave. By the time she gets to California, her family is actually part of this early Riverside settlement, along with people like An Chang-o and other people that you might know. Very small community. So Koreans in California in the early 20th century, they faced, really virulent anti-Asian racism. They also faced incredible poverty because it was really difficult to get jobs because racism means nobody wants to hire you. And the West Coast during the early 20th century, as I talked about this morning, the West Coast is a hotbed of anti-Asian sentiment and violence. And as I mentioned, right, it goes kind of the targets of that anti-Asian racism kind of shift from Chinese are excluded, then Japanese, and Koreans. Japanese and Koreans get excluded, later it's Indians, right? So it's basically, it kind of moves from one group to another. And the Lee family really felt the animosity. So Mary's family arrives in December 1906. They arrive at the port of San Francisco. By then, 1906, labor leaders in San Francisco had already formed the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, which I talked about this morning. That group was dedicated to making Japanese and Koreans the next target of exclusions. They wanted Congress to pass a law barring Japanese and Korean immigration because they wanted to protect America's Anglo-Saxon civilization from a, quote, coolie invasion. So Mary Paik Lee talks about how her family gets off the boat in San Francisco, literally the kind of minute they step off the boat, a group of young white men begin kind of harassing them. They spit in her face, they kick up her mother's skirt, and they begin to call her family names she had never heard before: Jap, Chinaman, right? This is 1906, she's, I think, 6 years old at this time. So, when we think about Mary Pick Lee, her experiences all obviously remind us that kind of anti-Asian violence, racism, these are not new things, not that we thought they were. But it really tells you kind of how extreme it was in that early period. Her father had a really hard time getting even menial jobs, and so she talks about just like not having food. She talks about like being so hungry that she would just drink a lot of water so that she could fall asleep. I mean, I think these are stories that folks might be familiar with just from immigration histories and also honestly from Korean War histories and Korean histories. But this is in California in the early 20th century. She talks about how in school, her teachers sometimes called Korea a, quote, barbarian country. She was called gook, which I didn't realize was a term people used back then. But she was called all kinds of names throughout her childhood. So she always felt like the other. And she always knew that her being Asian appearing did not work for her well in a place like California in the early 20th century. So Korean migration largely ends after this one short wave due to the Japanese colonization of Korea and the fact that I mentioned this morning that the labor contract that brought Koreans to the United States maybe was technically illegal and violated US contract labor laws. So after the 7,200 Koreans come, there's a lull. And there are a few folks who come in. I mean, Lee Seung-man comes in kind of during this period, this kind of post-period as a student. So there's a few people who are able to come in. But generally speaking, for the first half of the 20th century, Koreans, and especially after Japan colonizes Korea, Koreans are considered Japanese. They're grouped with Japanese for the purposes of US immigration and naturalization policy. And this, of course, angers many Koreans in the US who are staunchly opposed to Japanese colonization and who are very active in the diasporic Korean independence movement. And so there's all these efforts by Koreans in Hawaii, for example, to petition US officials to change Koreans' classification. They wanted to be classified as Korean, not as Japanese. That doesn't actually end up, their campaigns are not successful until World War II. So, early on, the struggle for Korea's independence from Japan between 1910 and 1945 really shapes the lives of Koreans in the United States. And again, Mary Pick Lee's life is a really good example here. And the struggle for independence, it structures communities and organizations. And this is across age, political position, class, educational backgrounds. The one thing that many Koreans shared in common was a deep desire for Korea's liberation from Japanese rule and a commitment to advance that goal however they could. And so, you had people teaching, their children the Korean language at churches and other places. And you also had all these kinds of drives, efforts to collect money that would support the Korean independence movement. And even people who, even workers who didn't make that much money to begin with would give money and time to the cause of Korean independence. And in fact, folks might know this, but the majority of the money that actually supported the Korean independence movement internationally, globally, between 1910 and 1945, the majority came from the United States. Because even if these folks were making menial wages, even if they were struggling, they gave so much. And US dollars were worth more and went farther in the global economy, even back then. And so the majority of money actually came from this oftentimes poverty-stricken Korean diaspora in the United States. And so you have groups like the Korean National Association. They're active in Honolulu, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They publish newspapers and they organized around the cause of Korea's independence from Japan. For decades they did this. By the time you get to World War, actually I'll say one more thing. And I think many folks probably know, since we're on the East Coast, when you think about what Koreans were doing here, I mean, you have many different kind of nationalist independence leaders like An Sang-ho. In 1919, 200 Korean community leaders gathered in Philadelphia. I think many folks are familiar with this story. So 200 Korean community leaders gather in Philadelphia for what they call the First Korean Congress. And the goal of the meeting is to mobilize and inspire fellow Koreans in the United States and to win support from influential white Americans for the cause of Korean independence. So after marching in the streets of downtown Philadelphia, the delegation of Korean immigrant patriots stood in Independence Hall for a public reading of the Korean Declaration of Independence. And this is an amazing kind of moment, and it corresponds with this Hamil Undong, or the March 1st movement in Korea. So this kind of mass demonstration of Koreans' desire for independence from Japan. And I mean, this is written about in various histories. So not only do you have folks in Korea fighting for independence, but you have people in the United States mobilizing regularly, giving money, doing all that they can for the cause of their homeland's independence. So decades of organizing for Korean independence comes to a head during World War II. And this is just an image, and these are all from the USC Korean American Digital Archive. I use these a lot. And they're readily available online if you're interested. This is a photo of the Korean unit of the California National Guard in 1942. So you have Koreans, some of whom are too old to enlist in the US military, some of whom are not citizens, and so there's some question about whether they're able to enlist directly in particular military units. So the California Korean unit includes some of these older folks. It includes folks who just want to show kind of their loyalty to the United States, who want to show kind of their desire to defeat Japan in World War II, to support the United States in defeating Japan. Of course, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes bombed Hawaii's Pearl Harbor, and then the next day, President Roosevelt declares the United States at war with Japan, and the United States officially enters the war. There's a whole conversation here about whether Koreans in the US should be classified with Japanese as, quote, enemy aliens. And again, there's a lot of Koreans in Hawaii and California who are fighting for Koreans to be classified, again, as specifically Korean, not as Japanese. Koreans, they basically, in Hawaii, California, they buy war bonds, in sums completely disproportionate to their community's very small size. And like I said, folks, right, serve in the US military in civilian brigades. And there's all this discussion, and I've looked at a lot of these documents. Korean Americans are like writing to US officials, they're talking to local authorities to kind of just say that they're really, really committed and they really want the US to win in World War II. Because to them, US victory means Korea's independence from Japan. And so after Pearl Harbor, you do see Korean Americans, oh, there she is, Mary Pickley. So after Pearl Harbor, Korean Americans, they unanimously welcome America's entry into World War II, but there's this problem that for many kind of non-Asians, for many white Americans, Koreans look physically very similar to the Japanese, right? So there's a way that Koreans become targets of racial violence, kind of anti-Japanese sentiment, and kind of anti-Japanese attacks carried out in the name of patriotism. So Koreans are not incarcerated alongside Japanese Americans during World War II, but there were many violent hate crimes perpetrated against them by people who saw little difference between Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and even Filipino Americans, right? So there's a similarity to what we've seen in the last few years, where literally during the beginning of the pandemic, or during the pandemic, there are a Burmese family in South Texas gets attacked. There are Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino women in places like Yonkers, New York. Literally anyone who looks vaguely Asian, right, could be very readily targeted. So you see a kind of similarity with today during World War II. And again, this is after Japanese Americans have been taken. So no Japanese Americans are around. They're literally in incarceration camps in California and places across the West Coast. But Koreans, Chinese, and others are still subjected to this kind of racial violence. And Mary Pickley in particular, she tells stories about, she actually tells a story about kind of what happens on the day of the Pearl Harbor bombing. So I think she was shopping on the evening of the Pearl Harbor attack. So Mary Pickley, she's living in Southern California, I think Whittier, California, and she stopped by her usual grocery store. It's a really interesting story. So the grocery store belongs to Richard Nixon's parents. Richard Nixon's parents, they know her. Richard Nixon's parents are also Christian. They're Quaker. They're very devout Quakers, or at least his mother is. And so Richard Nixon's mother is at the counter when another customer notices Mary and says loudly, quote, "There's one of those damned Japs now. What's she doing here?" And so Hannah Nixon is her name. Hannah Nixon swiftly comes to her defense. This is Mary's story. So Mary describes Mrs. Nixon kind of coming to her defense. She describes her as an angel. And Mrs. Nixon says, shame on you, right? You all know Mrs. Lee. You know she's not Japanese. And even if she were, she is not to blame for what happened at Pearl Harbor. This is the time to remember your religion and practice it, end quote. Right, so Mary leaves the store at that point. This is all in her autobiography, which I would really recommend to folks if you're interested, Quiet Odyssey. So at this point, Mary exits the store. She didn't even buy anything. She hadn't read the news, so she didn't know what was happening. And so this was all, happening very quickly. She had left her kids in the car. She hurries back, and she finds kind of her 1-year-old son in the car, and the car is surrounded by teenagers who are basically threatening to, punch the windows in. And she shouts at them, quote, "Does it take 3 of you to beat up a 1-year-old baby?" And so they all scatter. But, Mary describes the kind of terror she felt, and she also describes how her family, they sell vegetables from a roadside farm. That's how they make their living. And so, they get spit on, they get cursed at, and many of her friends have, their tires, the tires of their cars, the air put out of them. And, there are cases of Koreans being, stopped on the highway in California, taken out of their cars and beaten, right, because people are just associating them with the Japanese. And of course, this is a really big insult, in particular for Korean Americans who have been fighting for Korea's independence from Japan for many decades. So the whole story is, it just kind of goes to show this kind of racial ambiguity and the kind of racialization of Asian Americans. As much as Koreans themselves might not see themselves as having much in common with other Asian American groups, they really did share a common threat during this time period. Because from the outside, they get grouped with other people and racialized in different ways. So the next kind of wave was the post-Korean War migrations. And here, this is really the late 1950s into the 1960s. So this is the next major wave of Korean migration. Most of this migration is actually women and children. And a lot of them, like I mentioned, are Korean GI brides and child adoptees. On the left, it's a photo from Life magazine, November 1951. America's, quote, first Korean war bride comes home. And Life magazine is just full of photos. So if you look at, I did a paper once on war brides in Life magazine. There's so many, actually. There's so many stories about them, Japanese war brides, Korean war brides. And so you could actually follow the whole story. Her name is, they call her Blue. You can follow her whole story if you look at this issue of Life magazine. On the right, this is from July 16th, 1955. This is a group of children orphaned during the Korean War, and they're currently being cared for at the Children's Protective Home in Busan, South Korea. And so these are the kinds of images you see in US media. And, the reality is, during this period, I know the 1945 to 1950 time period, it's actually hard for me to talk about it because it's so complicated. And I actually think that many Koreans, as well as Korean Americans, don't fully understand or have the same narrative. What happened between the end of World War II and the Korean War? What happened such that the Korean Peninsula was divided into two countries, the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? So Kim Il-sung, Lee Seung-man, how did this happen, right? There is the way that US historians write about it, which really just has to do with foreign interference by the US and the Soviet Union, interference by the United Nations, boycotts, people who refuse to vote in one election or the other. So it's a lot. I have a friend actually writing a book about this, who I just saw earlier today, so I was very glad he's writing about this. He's Korean American as well. The reality is, once we get to the Korean War, so war breaks out, millions of Koreans are displaced, and US military GIs now stationed in Korea begin to have relationships with, and in some cases, marry Korean women. So women and children make up the majority of Korean immigrants in this wave. And so just to give you some numbers, between 1950 and 1965, approximately 7,700 women and 2,000 Korean children and 3,500 mixed race, quote, GI babies. So babies who have one parent who's Korean, one parent who's maybe white American, black American. So these numbers enter the United States, and Congress begins to change immigration policy to accommodate them, at least symbolically. So special laws are passed to allow Korean war brides to enter the United States, because at this time there's still racial restrictions on Asian immigration. So there's special laws passed just for them. And so by 1970, so within maybe 20 years, 13,904 Korean spouses of US servicemen had arrived in the United States. And there's all kinds of conversations about them. There are conversations about mixed-race children, both those who were brought to the United States and those who were left in Korea, and the kinds of discriminations they faced, particularly, in a place like Korea, the Daniel Minjok, the idea that, the bloodline, there's so much obsession with keeping things pure. And so thinking about how these children lived in Korea, how they were accepted, how they weren't accepted. And I also recognize that, with these Korean GI brides, I've been working with some teachers in California to develop curriculum around this chapter. And one of the women I'm working with had told me like, oh, I'm really glad you're writing about military brides because I feel like people still don't want to talk about them. Which is really interesting to me. Like, I get it. I do get it. At the same time that, like I said earlier today, historians like talk a lot about this stuff. Like when you think about, when folks talk about Korean immigration, when historians write about Korean immigration, a ton of books are actually about Korean military brides and about adoptees. And so it's a really big part of the historical or historians conversation, even if it might not be a big part of the kind of general conversation. So Korean adoptees also began to enter the US. And again, this was a story where you had Protestant missionaries who were really involved, people like Pearl Buck I mentioned earlier, Harry Holt, evangelical Christians. And you know, when you think about the role that they play, one historian calls Korean adoption kind of, quote, an example of, quote, Christian Americanism, this idea that fuses kind of what it means to be American with kind of this evangelical kind of Christian ethos about saving the children of Korea. There's actually a book called To Save the Children of Korea. That's one of the names of a well-known history book about Korean adoption. And a 1961 law creates a permanent quota specifically for adoptees. And the majority of adoptees, the last thing I'll say is, Korea actually plays a really important role in the history of international adoption. It's actually the beginning of international adoption as an industry. It begins in Korea after the Korean War. And so that's what historians write a ton about. It's how the adoption industry, first of all, it becomes an industry, but it starts with Korea and particularly with mixed race babies who are left after the Korean War. In addition to Korean women and children, there's also a small number of professionals and about 6,000 Korean exchange students who come to the US between 1955 and 1965. That might also include many of you in this room, or some of you in this room. Although most of those folks came as visitors, 90% of them stayed in the United States permanently and they made their home here. And those folks were chosen very strategically. They're usually educated elites and they're always anti-communist. So this is an interesting kind of history to talk about right now because there was a PBS documentary that premiered yesterday on PBS. This will be available until May on the pbs.org website to watch free of charge, and it's on the PBS app until the summer. So I watched this when it came out to LA maybe a year ago. So Chol-soo Lee is a working class Korean immigrant, and he's one of the very few Koreans to enter the US before 1965. He is the child of someone who married an American GI. In 1973, actually, how many of you have heard of Chol-soo Lee? Okay, he's not a name that I think many folks have heard of, and even for me, I study like Asian American history, and I hadn't heard about him until a few years ago. So in many ways, the filmmakers, it's Julie Ha and Eugene Lee, I believe, the filmmakers of this documentary, they're second-generation Korean Americans. They've done a great service, I think, to Korean Americans by creating this documentary so we can actually understand this history. So in 1973, Chol-soo Lee was racially profiled and accused of murdering a man in San Francisco's Chinatown. The actual murderer was a powerful Chinese-American gang leader who really shared very little in common with Chol-soo Lee, aside from the fact that they were both East Asian American and vaguely looked East Asian. So the prosecution's case mainly rested on the testimony of white tourists who picked Lee out of a police lineup. They claimed to have seen Lee shoot a gun from across a busy intersection. But there are all kinds of irregularities. Chol-soo Lee was about half a foot shorter than the actual murderer. He had no known motives. It was unclear whether he had ever even seen the person who was shot before. But government prosecutors were really eager to close the case, and so they expedited the conviction and they buried counter evidence that would have proven Lee's innocence. So Lee goes to jail. And while in prison, Lee fatally stabs a fellow inmate. And he claims to have acted in self-defense, but even so, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. And this is all happening over 1973. And so if you watch the documentary, I love these images. If you watch the documentary, you'll see some of the different people who came together to campaign to overturn these two murder convictions and to win Lee's freedom. So this movement actually brought together first-generation Korean immigrants, 할머니들, with radical third-generation Japanese and Chinese Americans. And so here you just have some images. It's actually quite amazing to think about So this is like, I think, a table of students at Berkeley. You see Berkeley. So it mobilizes like a wide range of folks from different generations, different ethnic backgrounds. You have non-Asian Americans also involved because they're fighting for what they believe is justice. In the documentary on PBS, you can see pastors at Korean churches in the Sacramento area talking about Lee's case from the pulpit. I was looking for those images, I couldn't find them, but they're in the documentary because I remember watching them. Okay, no. So in 1983, the Free Chol-soo Lee Defense Committee, they actually won Lee's release, and the courts overturned his 2 murder convictions. This is the first time that had ever happened in the history of the US legal system, so it's a huge legal victory. So remembering the movement to free Chol-soo Lee reminds us that Koreans in the US, they have actually organized and participated in movements for justice. And for Americans used to seeing Koreans as kind of apolitical and disconnected from social activism and justice, kind of these kinds of movements, the mobilization around Lee's case, they demonstrate the possibility to imagine otherwise, to think about kind of this history of fighting for justice within the Korean American community. So again, I would really recommend watching that documentary. It's free, like I said, it's on pbs.org. The third wave is post-65 Korean immigration. That's my mom. On the top right, she's a nurse. And on the right, that's the store that my parents opened in Brooklyn Heights, New York. It's now owned by my uncle. That's me and my daughter last month when we went to visit my family. So no single law has shaped Korean and broader Asian immigration to the US more than the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. As I mentioned this morning, but I'll just summarize briefly, the law completely changes the racial demographics of immigrants. So rather than being like 90% European, the law basically creates a majority Asian and Latinx or Latin American migration stream. And this law, it ends decades of Asian exclusion, and it's based on job skills and family reunification. So my mom was able to enter because she got a visa as a nurse, because nurse was one of the jobs listed on the US Department of Labor list of what jobs had openings and what kinds of people were needed. So that's how my mom came in. It's how probably some of you came in as well. 3/4 of the Koreans who left Korea after 1965 settled in the United States. So this single law is really what creates a lot of what we know as Korean America today. In contrast to folks who came before 65, many of these post-65 people were urban, many of them were professional, many of them had kind of educational trainings and backgrounds, but not all pursued the careers in the fields they were trained for. So stories abound, and many of you probably know this, stories abound of nurses, engineers, and others kind of foregoing those fields and choosing instead to open small businesses based on the belief that small business offered greater economic mobility and would enable maybe you to or them to avoid racism and language barriers in job hiring and promotion. So by the 1980s, about 1 in 3 Korean immigrants in the US operated a small family-run business, like my parents. They opened this store, Plymouth Deli, in 1979. So by the 1990s, Greater Southern California, so that's kind of the largest Korean American population, Greater Southern California was home to the largest Korean American communities in the country. So in Los Angeles alone, the Korean population grew from about 8,900 in 1970 to nearly 150,000 by 1990. So it really multiplies quickly. Due to limited access and language barriers, many of the region's Korean-owned businesses were located in heavily Black or brown, oftentimes economically depressed neighborhoods such as South Los Angeles. As the number of Korean businesses grew, conflict erupted between Korean storekeepers and local Black residents in particular. And as I mentioned this morning, this was true for other cities in the country, including New York City. And so when I think about Brooklyn in 1990, there are also boycotts in Brooklyn against Korean business owners. But as I also mentioned, that did not escalate in the same way that it did in Los Angeles for many different reasons that political scientists have actually done work to try to systematically think about. So a couple things I'll say. So when we think about what happened in Los Angeles, what we now call Haigu in 1992, this is really hard to talk about. It's actually really hard for me to talk about this too. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think about my own family, I think about kind of my own parents, I think about so many things. So in Los Angeles, there are already these events, particularly, or actually what I'll do is I'll start here. So by the early 1990s, even by the late 1980s, there's already perceptions of Black-Korean conflict, and it had become kind of a narrative, very visible in popular culture. So there's a 1990 song, Black Korea, by rapper Ice Cube. You can look at the lyrics right there. Movies like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing featured kind of Korean storekeepers and lots of kind of conflict between Black actors and the Korean storekeepers. So again, New York City features centrally in these conversations, like pop culture conversations, but LA was the first site where these tensions between Black and Koreans boiled over. And so in Los Angeles, as I also mentioned this morning, a year before the Rodney King acquittals, the acquittal of the 5 police officers, the LAPD, who were accused of beating Rodney King in kind of police brutality. So they were acquitted a year later. But in March 16, 1991, this is actually within weeks of the Rodney King beating itself. So March 1991 is really kind of a big moment. There's a Korean storekeeper named Sun Ja-do who kills Latasha Harlins. Latasha Harlins, as I mentioned earlier, she's a teenager. She's shot, she dies, and it's over whether she had stolen a carton of orange juice, and it turns out the security cameras show that she actually had not stolen it. She was bringing out kind of the money out of her pocket. But Sun Ja-do shoots her in the back, and she dies. And there's actually, historians have done work on this case. One of the best books probably is by a historian named Brenda Stevenson. She talks about the contested murder of Latasha Harlins, and she looks at the 3 women involved in the case. So Latasha Harlins, obviously, on the left. The judge who actually finds Sun Ja-do, kind of who basically suspends any kind of jail sentence. So the jury does actually find Sun Ja-do guilty. But the judge in the middle, she has the discretion to basically kind of just dismiss the charges or kind of to dismiss the punishment. And so Judge Joyce Carlin, she suspends the jail sentence. So Sun Ja-do eventually has no jail time, and she pays a $500 fine, and she might cover some funeral expenses. But it looks like she basically gets a slap on the wrist, right, and isn't really punished for the crime. And so in Los Angeles, when people talk about Rodney King, they're also always talking about Latasha Harlins as well. That's why Koreans are always a part of the conversation in Los Angeles, even though they're not always part of the national conversation during this period. Although when they are part of the national conversation, I really hate this image, right? This is the image that at least people in the national media see. So there are these Black Korean conflict narratives that US kind of mainstream media publish photos like this. This idea of rooftop Koreans, it's actually mentioned in the show Beef, because it's a big part of kind of Los Angeles Korean American history. This image also gets memed. There are memes of this on Twitter sometimes. And so when you think about what this signifies to lots of people, like I know that probably all of these storekeepers feel abandoned by the police. I also know that probably most of all of these men probably had military training and knew how to use firearms because they went to Korean compulsory military service in Korea. Like there are all these things that we know as Korean Americans, but for people just seeing these images and not knowing anything about Korean America, like there are so many misperceptions also as well. This is why Haegu is one of the most difficult things to talk about, even as a historian. It's extremely difficult to talk about. And it's not an easy topic to talk about either. Because as I mentioned earlier, when you think about racial capitalism, that's a very, very difficult term. But essentially what it comes down to is the idea that you can't separate racialization and race from capitalism or access to resources, access to money, access to stores, access to capital. And that these things, so capitalism and racialization are entangled. And so when you think about where Korean Americans fit into this kind of hierarchy, this racial hierarchy, Korean Americans are not at the bottom, right? Korean Americans do have more access to things like stores, like my parents who were able to come to the US and open a store after 4 years. There's ways that they had access, more access than Black and brown folks in Brooklyn Heights, New York in 1979. Does that mean that they didn't suffer from racism? No. My parents suffered from incredible racism, and I hear about their stories. And, I've had my Como punched in the face, at the store. So, I think we all, this is a very complicated history, and what I would encourage us all to do in thinking about these histories, instead of kind of trying to think about this as a competition, like who suffered more, to think about it as all and, right? So it's all of these things can be true at the same time. It can be true that Korean Americans faced incredible racism, and they suffered, and they worked really hard, and this is what the LAPD did to them. They abandoned them during this Haegu events. That's 100% what happened, or that is true. At the same time, we can also say that black and brown folks in South Los Angeles and in places like kind of South Koreatown did feel like they were being completely blocked from having any kind of economic opportunity. They also many times felt like they were being discriminated against by Korean storekeepers who might not look them in the face or who might not like give them money in their hands, right? There's all these efforts by both communities to try to kind of train or help Korean storekeepers treat their black customers more respectfully. There were similar efforts in New York City. So all these things can be true at the same time, that there is mutual suffering, that there is suffering happening, and that because of kind of the fact that all of these folks, these racialized communities, Koreans, blacks, they're all living in a society that is structured to benefit whiteness. Not just white people, but whiteness, right? So when you think about who actually creates the entire power structure, it's not Koreans and it's not black communities, right? So kind of thinking about like what are the kind of oppressive structures that all racialized communities feel the burden of. So I think that's one way that I think about it. That's one way I try to wrestle through these questions because it's really hard. And in the last couple minutes, what I wanted to also talk about, so there's all these kind of efforts toward a kind of multiracial unity. There's a lot of activism, there are a lot of groups. I've gone to a number of panels in Los Angeles with community activists. Like decades later, they're still working. They're still trying to work together. Churches were a big part of this as well, but I've interviewed a lot of folks about whether those church coalitions have continued and, you know, beyond having like potlucks together and like worship services once in a while. It's tricky, right? It's challenging to create lasting coalitions. It's hard for anyone, but including for churches. And the last point I'll kind of talk about is to think about post-1990 migration. So this is a post-1990 migration of a lot of kind of migrants with more resources. Chinese migrants come with large pots of money because of the 1990 Immigration Act, which gives preference to immigrants who have money to invest. So Koreans also take advantage of this. At the same time that that's happening, the number of undocumented Koreans also increases dramatically. So these numbers are from 2015, which is unfortunately, 8 years ago. But you kind of get a sense here. So undocumented Asian Americans, there's actually a lot of them. They don't always cross the border. Oftentimes, they just overstay their visas. And I think a lot of folks probably know people in the community who are undocumented. Today, more than kind of 200,000 undocumented Koreans live in the United States. They're actually, again, they complicate how we understand Korean America. And rather than kind of erase and try to pretend they don't exist, particularly in a place like LA County, there are lots of organizations and communities that are committed to serving undocumented Korean Americans, because it's not easy to be undocumented in the United States. And so California is the site where most of these undocumented Asian Americans live, but New York, I mean, your state's probably on here. This is where a lot of Asian Americans live. That's where they live as well. And the very last thing that I wanted to talk about, which I also talk about, and I end my chapter in the textbook with this as well, because I find this really hilarious at the same time that it's just hilarious. So I love Hallyu. I've read books about Hallyu, not because I study Korean history necessarily, but because I'm just interested in Hallyu and like the role of the South Korean government, all these different things. I've read so many books. It's fascinating. I like BTS. I'm not like an army, but they're scary on Twitter. They're scary. You can't insult BTS ever. So this is from BTS's visit to the White House in May 2022. So this is last year. And this was kind of a muted conversation because I think people were afraid to say this on Twitter because literally BTS Army will just jump on you if you say anything negative. So BTS was brought to the White House. There's Joe Biden doing this, right? So BTS was brought to the White House to raise awareness around anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, right? And we all know how much anti-Asian violence has jumped. But there were a few folks who were like, why are you bringing BTS? To speak about the issue of anti-Asian violence. The visit did accomplish what the White House wanted. It attracted global attention. I mean, they have so many followers on social media, so they probably got more attention than any Korean American I can think of would ever get. But there's a lot of kind of questions about so inviting a Korean band to stand in for Asians living in the United States who are facing an onslaught of racist violence, it kind of really blurs the line between Asians and Asian Americans, Koreans and Korean Americans. And the reality is, like, there is less and less of a divide, I think, especially like lots of folks go back and forth, yuaksing, but they're not really yuaksing, they just live here, they live everywhere. So like there's a lot more blurring nowadays than there used to be. But there really is a question about kind of to what extent do kind of events like these actually recognize the distinctiveness of what it means to be someone who considers himself Korean American or Asian American. And like I watch K-dramas. I do all that stuff too. You know, I love being Korean American. But you know, I like what's that called? Parasite. Like I like that movie, right? But there's a way in which the prominence and popularity of Korean pop culture can at times overshadow and contribute to Korean Americans' racialization as maybe not really American, but kind of as extensions of this South Korea, extensions of Asia. And in reality, I mean, most of us live as kind of, right, we're all of the above. We're Korean American, we're Asian American, we're members of Korean diasporas. But I think the challenge remains to help others understand that it's possible to have all of these identities at the same time. And I think that's something that's difficult for non-Asian Americans to understand in particular. But, you know, I think many of us kind of, this is how we live in our daily life. So I will stop there. And if there are any questions, I'd love to hear them. We just have a couple minutes left. Thank you.
Yeah, so I am a child of, you know, like the LA riots and all the things that happened. And so, so I think in particular for me, you know, when the whole BLM movement happened and then our young people in our church wanted us to like stand with BLM, all this stuff, I really had to wrestle with a lot of like internal racism and because all the bullying that I received, you know, from Black communities growing up. And then I looked around and, you know, especially those who were in my age group who went through those same things, it was kind of split even in our predominantly Pan-Asian church that the young people wanted us to really, you know, to really move alongside the BLM movement, but the older, like, you know, like those in the late 30s and 40s and 50s, they had a harder time holding on to these things. And I questioned a lot. The younger generation who didn't have that strong of emotional trauma as some of the older ones really attached and pushed the AAPI, all these things. But I had a lot of older people who went through these traumas, and for me, you know, I saw a lot of younger people trying to attach their identity to this trauma that they didn't experience themselves. And so, what do you think is, I don't know, maybe my question is more pastoral, but like how do we reconcile, you know, kind of like what's happening with the younger Asian American population who's trying to attach themselves to the traumas of the older generation, and, you know, how does maybe the old generation kind of reconcile like these traumas that we have from like the LA riots and whatnot, so, yeah.
I mean, it sounds like you're actually having conversations, right, in your congregation between older and younger. Because I feel like that's one thing, right, that I can think of. Because I think a lot of folks, when I think of younger folks, generational change is fast, you know? So even when you think about, like in Korea, like anti-Japanese sentiment among older generations versus younger generations, it's just so different. And then, so I feel like that might be similar here. And I understand, now that I live in Los Angeles and I married a Korean American from Los Angeles, his family was not directly impacted by 1992. They did not own a small business. But like hearing their stories and kind of getting to understand more about people's experiences, like it's very painful. So I think, especially if you're in Los Angeles, maybe encouraging those conversations, because I think those younger folks need to know their history too, and that is part of actually the history of Korean America, even though it's extremely painful to kind of think about and talk about. And I think in terms of like Black Lives Matter, BLM, I mean, I'm an academic, so like, what am I gonna say? I'm like way over here on the left. But the reality is, like, I understand like different generations have different views, and questions about reciprocity, like, you know, does a solidarity go both ways? And it doesn't always, and that's a very difficult thing. That's extremely difficult to experience. Within academia, people talk about that too, more in hushed tones, but that's real. But it's also about understanding where we sit in the power structures, and I think as Christians, like if something is just, like if a cause is just, whether or not you feel reciprocity, whether or not you feel, in some ways, I think you're still called to advocate for folks who have less power than you do. So even if it's just based on that, kind of the call for Christians to act justly, I think you could still make biblical, you could make a case, right, for why Korean Americans should still care and should still act. But it's really hard. But I think it's important to have those conversations intergenerationally. And I haven't been in a Korean church. I haven't been in a Korean church setting for a while, so I'm actually kind of envious. But like the idea that you could have like young people come together with older people, as long as the older folks are willing to talk about it in ways that are not just, completely unproductive, which is hard too, because folks have trauma. So these are really hard conversations. Like I said, I gave 4 talks on this last year. I talk about it now, and it's like the most difficult thing I've ever done in my academic career is to think about how my family fits in the story of 1992. Even though we were in New York City, even though, right, we were 3,000 miles away from what happened in 92, like what does it mean to be Korean American in a society that treats you terribly, but then in a society where you actually have more access in some ways than other communities? Like how do you balance these realities? And how do you live faithfully in these very complicated realities? It's extremely difficult, and I think all of you know this, but I would encourage you to really confront these questions, as painful as they are.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. That was great. Very insightful for me, especially that photo of the National Guard unit. So I have a multi-part question. In your research, have you come across any examples of Korean Americans fighting in the Korean War?
Korean Americans fighting in the Korean War?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think there's actually, so there are not that many, so it's very, very few. But I do believe you have a few. You also have so you actually have more Japanese Americans fighting in the Korean, isn't that strange? You have more Japanese Americans fighting in the Korean War. And in terms of the US military troops who are occupying Southern Korea between 1945 and 1948, that like in-between period of US military occupation, there's a whole bunch of Japanese American soldiers actually who are stationed there. There's actually been, historians have written about that because there is so much, it's so complex because these folks kind of look like the local Koreans, but they're not. They speak English, they're Japanese American, they're US citizens. And so there are lots of like strange racial dynamics. The number of Koreans is really low, I think, at that point.
The second part is, how do you think the outcome of the Korean War affected Korean Americans who were already in the States in 1953? And then additionally, how do you think the ongoing conflict, what kind of psychological impact does that have on Korean Americans today?
On the first question, I actually wrote about this in my dissertation, but it wasn't in my first. I had 2 chapters on Korea in my dissertation, but they weren't in my first book, so I published them elsewhere. In the United States, there were, like I said, fewer than 10,000 Korean Americans living here in the 1950s when the Korean War broke out. Some people were actually very critical. Some Korean Americans very critical of what the US was doing in South Korea. Several of them were detained by the US government. Some of them were actually deported by the US government. And I think there's actually a whole bunch of graduate students who I just met in the last couple of months who are writing about these kind of left-wing radical Korean Americans who are living in the US during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. By today's standards, many people would probably call them communists. They were somewhat sympathetic. Actually, they were sympathetic to the Soviet occupation in the north. And it's a complicated kind of history, but many of them, like some of them were Korean American, they were US citizens, others weren't. And so the ones who weren't generally got deported or else were detained. So there's actually a lot of legal cases involving Koreans in the 1950s. And it's actually kind of interesting. So McCarthyism, you don't think about Asians during McCarthyism in America, but Asian Americans got caught up in that too. In terms of how kind of the Korean War and its non-ending in 1953 shapes Korean American communities today. I mean, my grandparents, I'm sure, depending on how old you are, like your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, I mean, we're all affected by this. Like, literally, we're all affected by this. And I remember my 할아버지, my grandfather, like I did a series of oral histories with him before he passed away. He died in 2007. but my Harabaji spoke Japanese. He like spent World War II so he spent time in Japan teaching, and then he like worked in a kind of factory in Manchuria during World War II, and then he finally came back to Korea. So he told us stories kind of about what he was doing basically during that time, during Japanese colonialism, and then what happened to him during the war. And I feel like that's maybe something that Korean Americans share in common, like whether or not it's your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, it's like you have a story of somebody who survived the Korean War, because literally, like, you're here. So somebody came from somewhere and made it to the United States. But I think the Korean War is so, I don't need to tell all of you. By the way, there's actually a bunch of academics who started something called the Ending the Korean War Initiative. So it's scholars who study Korea, mostly Korean Americans, but not just Korean Americans. And I went to a meeting of theirs last month. And they're still trying to find ways to try to raise awareness of the Korean War to make sure that it gets taught in US history classrooms. So like a lot of folks will teach World War II, they'll teach Vietnam Wars, but they want to make sure that the Korean War is not the forgotten war anymore. And so there's a lot of academics who are trying to mobilize for this. And so that's been a really encouraging development, to try to make sure people understand and remember the memory of this war, and to take it seriously as something that, actually matters, because we all know it matters, because it really shaped our entire lives in many ways, and our families' lives. And it continues to divide families even today. So obviously we know it matters, and the stakes are very high. But thank you for asking that question. Oh,
you mentioned that of basically all the Korean immigrants, some 70, 80 something percent are, have a Protestant background, but then obviously I'm fascinated by the fact that we're celebrating 70 years, which means that this church started pre-1965, when there was less than, I forget the number, 10,000 or whatever. Yeah. The role of churches, I was always told by pastors and people, is that the church was a place where people gathered, right? This was not only just a religious place, but it was a social place and things like that. Is the kind of the boom of Korean churches, most of them obviously post-1965, and you talked about skilled migrant workers, were pastors and theological workers and that kind, were they part of that group? Like, where did this come from? Because in the beginning, obviously there's a church relation to it all, but in the history it doesn't feel like it's really mentioned, or at least not in today's lecture. So can you kind of give us a little bit of insight on how that kind of came to be? Because again, 70 years here, this is a pre-1965 church, which is fascinating. But then a lot of other churches are celebrating, I think, largely 40 to 50 years, which means those are mostly post-1965 churches. And so how does that kind of play in this idea of us understanding the past to better understand present and the future together as the church anyway?
No, that's a great question. I've studied this in other communities, like the impact of post-65 immigrants on like the Chinese church communities are huge. Like literally they just create new churches, a lot of the new arrivals. I think for Korean Americans, because there's a much smaller community, it's like new arrivals after 65, my understanding is they do actually join pre-existing Korean congregations as well as creating their own. And in terms of kind of what denominations they're joining all kinds of denominations. And also like the KPCA, so the Korean Presbyterian denominations that are not US based, like those are formed, I believe, in the 1970s, 1980s. So Koreans are also forming their own denominational structures apart from white denominational structures. I mean, I don't think the 65 Act, I don't think it classifies clergy separately. I don't believe so. But there are special provisions and special, I think, dispensations for clergies. Although the R1 visa, which some of you might be familiar with, the religious worker visa, so the US government tests it several times. It's like informally used in various ways, but it doesn't become an official visa until 1990. I'm actually gonna write an article on it because I find it really fascinating, the R1 visa. But like informally, I think the government does recognize clergy, and lots of folks who come to the US are coming to study at places like Fuller Seminary, the chapter I'm currently writing on. So there's also students, right, who are able to enter the United States, seminarians who are able to enter the United States, and many of whom then stay in the United States after they're done. There's a ton of people along those lines. And so I feel like you do have more and more clergy coming to the US, and so that allows, of course, them to open churches. It also influences so depending on which clergy are coming, it influences what kind of churches, right, will get planted, what denominations are represented. There's a lot more I could say, but I think also just when you think about again, the story that Helen Jin Kim, the historian, tells about just the number of U.S. evangelical organizations in Korea that were active in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So I mentioned earlier World Vision, Campus Crusade for Christ Korea, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. I know this because my kunabaji, one of them, became Christian in Korea in the 1960s through Campus Crusade for Christ Korea. So there's a lot, right? There's also those kinds of connections where you have people, they come to faith in Korea through Korean versions or Korean kind of communities that are connected to kind of U.S. evangelical communities. And so they're also bringing their faith with them to the United States. So, I mean, there's a lot more I could say, but yeah, I mean, it really is amazing how kind of formative Protestant Christianity has been to Korean America. And so I'm glad that everyone in this room, it's a self-selected group, you all recognize the importance of understanding that history. So, thank you.
Thank you for this impressive presentation, Dr. Jane Hong. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll begin at the final session at 8:20. Yes. Okay. Before we start, I wanted to make a quick announcement for tomorrow. Please note there will be a group discussion at 9 a.m. Tomorrow. Our second speaker tonight is David Eunil. At this time, please welcome Elder Sang Kang, who will be introducing him.
Hi. Thank you, Jane, for the stories you're telling us about history. One word I can describe the last 2 days. I mean, you are a person with emotion. You can feel only one word I can describe is sobering. Yeah, it is. I mean, today I love that Jane showed the last picture was a BTS with the president. That's all we're talking about right now. Today is we're not talking about sobering history of either a Native Indian or Korean American history. So anyway, let's go and move on to the next one. So far, we have heard from 3 great speakers. They made us look deeper into beyond what it appears to be, in line with the theme of our symposium. Yeah, two tales of a city upon the hill. Now we will hear from Dr. David Eunil Choi, titled Practicing Korean American Theology. Oh, that's telling the stories, generation to generation. As a person, for me, is who involved with it's a second gen. Some of you understand what it means, second generation. Or EM is the English ministry. That's only Korean American churches know their words. And that's the ministry. I'm involved with 27 years, 28 years. So I'm really, really very excited to expect to listen to great things from Dr. Cho's presentation. So the Reverend Dr. Eunil David Choi is Assistant Professor of Spiritual Care and Counseling at Boston University School of Theology. He received his MD, PhD from Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia. At BU, he teaches practical theology, spiritual care, chaplaincy, religion and health, and the congregational studies. He's currently working on a book titled Migration as a Theologizing Experience, Religious Stories of Undocumented Young Adults. He's also an ordained minister in Peace USA, yay. And currently serving as a vice moderator of a Mid-Atlantic Synod, which covers Virginia and North Carolina. Will become the moderator in this September. So let's get warm welcome to Dr. Cho.
Yeah. 감사합니다. Thank you everyone for being here. Just want to say this is the toughest time of the day for you to be here, so I'm so impressed. 감사합니다. 이렇게 어려운 시간에 이런 강의를 들으시려고 이 자리에 계셔가지고 I'm just so thankful. Yeah, you should pat yourself. Yeah. So I just want to name that. It's big appreciation. And also, as I represent 1.5 Gen, so I'll be speaking in English primarily, but I'll throw some Koreans here and there to emphasize some things, because I noticed that a lot of people in this room are Korean speaking. So to honor my small way to honor you, I'm going to speak both languages. Okay, so I'm going to do that. But also I just want to just begin by just saying thank you all for being here. But also 구장로님 mentioned about his journey of planning this symposium in November, right? November something. But actually for me, that I found out about the symposium in August, way before you did. On my first few days in Boston, I had lunch with Reverend Lee, and 이 목사님 welcomed me and bought me food, and then he shared his vision of symposium, right? At that time I didn't know what that meant. 무슨 말씀하신지 잘 몰랐는데 그때 심포지엄에 대해서 얘기를 막 해주시더라고요. 그러면서 막 닥터 차도 있고 뭐 this is like God is doing something here in Boston. So so I just want to just appreciate his leadership. Not many people can really gather many people, gather reasons. Let's give him a hand. Yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Woo. Yeah. And thank you. And also the KCV members, I'm part of this church. I'm an affiliate pastor, so this is my community as well. And also my parents are here. Also my dean's here. Dr. Dean Sujin Pak, Dean of BU School of Theology. So this is a lot of pressure. And also a lot of older brothers that I've been knowing for a while since I began ministry. So this feels like a family business. And BTS, yeah. Maybe, we'll talk about it later. All right. So today I'll be talking about practicing Korean American theology. What a great title, right? Practicing Korean American theology. But at the same time, who am I? 내가 뭔데? Who am I to say things about Korean American theology or Korean American practical theology? I was so overwhelmed by just that how big it is and how diverse it is. So I was like, wow, 내가 뭔데? 이런 거. Who am I to be the final one to bring these all up together? But I'm a practical theologian. That means I study theology, but I study theology in conversation with other disciplines like social science. So for me, psychology and sociology are my main expertise, and I look at how we can practice theology. And even in School of Theology here, I mainly work with students who are becoming ministers, chaplains, practitioners. So that's my research interest as well. That's what really shapes my teaching. So I'm in this room, I'm noticing that a lot of you are practitioners. You are the experts in your field. Some of you are from East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, South. You are the experts in your context. So before I say anything to you, I want to share that you're already doing practical theology in your own context. You're already practicing Korean American theology in your churches. You know the local congregation, you know the local context. So you're already expert. I just want to name that first. So what I'm here to share with you is something that I've studied and the interesting data and maybe new ways to think about what you've been doing and also maybe some new hermeneutical keys, right? As ministers, we deal with text a lot. So we deal with sacred text and also living human text, people's story. So what are some new hermeneutical keys that you can think of? So I'm here very humbled, but also as a fellow minister. I'm a scholar, but also a fellow minister who care deeply about the church. So I hope that whatever you hear from me and also other wonderful speakers, I hope that you will take these with you to your own context and wrestle with them and contextualize them. And also speak back to us. We need, right? Scholars need to hear from practitioners. So we want to hear from you in a lasting coalition, not just like one-time event. So next, I have this. So unlocking the past for a better future together, stories of Native American and Korean American churches. So this was the main title of our symposium, right? So I did some word study. So I looked up some keywords, right? Keywords and phrases because like, what am I trying to do? Like, or what should I say? Like, what should I bring to our people here? And so, so unlocking the past, that's been definitely a key phrase here. Unlocking the past, learning the past, also uplifting the past that's been untold, seldom heard, right? Uplifting the stories that's been seldom heard. And also for a better future, right? So learning the past and better future, what's the connection there? And also together, we don't do it alone. It's not something that I do by myself, but something that we do we do this in community as a church. And also, yes, untold stories, right? So how these things all come together. And then after doing some word studies, and then I was able to turn that into a question, turn it into a guiding question for us to think about this final conversation, which is how does unlocking stories from the past enable us to imagine a better future for Korean American churches together? How does unlocking stories from the past enable us to imagine a better future for Korean American churches together, right? That's what we're doing here, right? So this is another way for us to really remember, oh, this is why we're here. This is what we do here. So to put that in Korean, 우리의 과거의 이야기를, 우리의 과거의 역사를 들여다보미, 우리가 과거의 역사를 공부하는 것이 그것이 어떻게 우리가 한인 교회의 더 나은 미래를 상상해 볼 수 있도록 도움이 될까요? 라는 하는 이제 한국말로 한번 더 풀어봤습니다. So this is the guiding question for us. This is what we've been doing it together. So at first, I want to talk about storytelling. So in this symposium, we talked a lot about stories, narratives, right? And that's been part of, we use that word a lot, right? To identify ourselves or that to talk about our sacred text, the Bible. We also learned, even in this morning, we talked about how does power shapes the way we engage storytelling, right? Whose voices are missing and whose stories gets often told, right? So I want to think together about why we tell stories and why does storytelling matter in our lives. So what do we mean when we say storytelling and narratives? So I want to give you an exercise to do. Oh, I know, like some of you are saying, like, 지금 들리고 있어요. 뭐 한다고 하니까 힘들어하시는데, but I'm gonna kind of treating you guys as my class, right? So we're gonna do this short exercise, which is, I want to give you like 1 minute to reflect on this question on your own. Okay? The question is, who is your favorite Bible character, and what about his or her or their story do you find relatable and meaningful for you, to you? I already hear Jesus. Wow, that's great. So, but for different reasons, right? So, I'll give you about 30 seconds to think on your own. 여러분이 가장 좋아하시는 성경의 인물 한번 생각해 보시고요. 그 사람의 그 사람의 이야기 어떤 점이 여러분은 개인적으로 그 사람과 이렇게 그 사람을 가장 그런 인물로 생각할 수 있는지 한번 생각해 보시는 시간이 있으면 좋겠습니다. So I'll give you 30 seconds for you to reflect on this question, and you don't have to come up with the answer. But just the point is to reflect on it, right? After 30 seconds, I'm gonna give you time to pair up with someone next to you and talk about it. 어렵죠? 괜찮아요. 옆에 계신 분들하고 어떤 생각 하셨는지 대화하는 시간도 해볼 거예요. 아시겠죠? 좀 힘드시더라도 하실 수 있겠죠? Right. So okay, so I'll give you about 30 seconds to think about who's your favorite Bible character and what about his or her or their story do you find relatable? I'll give you 30 seconds and yeah, think about it, and then I'll give you a cue for discussion with someone next to you. I think some of you are already ready to go. That's okay. Good. It's good. So find a partner and just talk about what you thought. I'll give you 2 more minutes. So one more minute. Thirty seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right. Yes. I'm too sorry to kill the mood. It's so good to see you guys engage with one another. So I hope that this isn't the last time for you to think about and reflect on this question. But if you were so kind and brave to share your favorite character with people here, anyone would like to just share your favorite character? Oh, yes, Eunil 목사님. Oh, so we need your mic. Yeah. Maybe a short reason why.
Barnabas, because he was a person of encouragement.
Yes. Having known her, she's yeah. person of encouragement. Thank you. Barnabas, right. Anyone else?
Oh, I already did a sermon in this church about a month ago about this 혈루병을 앓는 여자. I forgot how to say that in
Bleeding woman?
Yeah,
bleeding woman.
And the nameless women in the Bible. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I did a sermon here about that bleeding woman, 혈루병 앓는 여자. Those women in the Bible who do not really know, who are not really known and nameless. I think that's more relatable to me, realistically. Like there are so many ideal characters, but I'm so, falling short of them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Mine is Daniel, because Daniel is
Daniel.
so wise and courageous.
Daniel so wise and
Courageous.
Thank you. 감사합니다.
제가 생각하는 사람은 에스터.
Esther.
It's because her so much passionate toward her motherland.
감사합니다. 네. Esther was so passionate about helping the people from her land, right? Thank you. Anyone else? Last chance. Abraham. Sorry? Immigrant. Yes. Thank you. You all read my mind. Great. 좋습니다. Right? So, thank you. So, in the Bible, right, there are many stories, right? Many stories of individuals. Some, and they're all great. And their stories are brave and great and all that. But also there are a lot of stories of failures and stories of mistakes and stories of pain and loss and challenges, exactly because a lot of characters in the Bible are migrants, right? They were away from home. They were displaced. They left their homes, and that's how they met God, right? And then the migration become theologizing experience, right? Thank you so much. So as you share with one another, right? As you use your favorite Bible character to communicate with one another, what you essentially do here is that you share who you are, right? It can be awkward at times to do this kind of exercise, especially if you have not known that person. But when we share stories like this, we're just not sharing information. This is my favorite person. This is my favorite character. But by saying that I relate to Barnabas because of his particular character, that also shows something about who you are as well, right? So we engage stories, especially for Christians in the Bible. We engage stories in a way, we do not only engage stories to read information or get piece of information, but when we read stories, we relate to them. We let the stories, the characters, and the plots and lessons and ideas speak to us, and that shapes who we are. So, next. So Dan P. McAdams, he's a psychologist who studies why people engage in storytelling. And he says, if you want to know me, then you must know my story, for my story defines who I am. And if I want to know myself to gain insight into the meaning of my own life, then I too must come to know my own story. And let me read this in Korean. 당신이 나를 알기를 원한다면 나의 이야기를 들어야 합니다. 제 이야기가 곧 저의 정체성이기 때문입니다. 그리고 저 역시도 제 자신을 더 깊게 잘 알기를 원한다면 저의 이야기를 잘 알아야 합니다. That means when we tell stories, we are communicating who we are to other people. Your stories, your narratives are stories. Your stories are your identities. This is an idea called narrative identity. We are the stories we tell. As a Korean Americans, not everyone here, but as fellow migrants or people, especially in this room, we've been in places where we have to wrestle a lot with our identities, right? So in America, when we say identity, we think of something like this. Census, right? We live in this society where we are to identify ourselves, we have to tell who we are by checking these marks, right? Whether that's your gender or your race or your age, right? And also your ethnicity. This is how we do it, right? And that's how we introduce ourselves to each other as well. Recently, I read this article, how this self-introduction is a very American thing. For us to share where are you from, right? Like, and for us to have this small talk, right? If you do that in other countries, like they might think you're like, oh, like, whoa. So that's a very American thing, right? But because American society has been shaped in a way that we are to identify one another, right? So it's a one thing to wrestle with our identity, right? Who we are, but it's also another thing to communicate who we are to other people, right? So we do this census way, surveying way of identifying who we are so that we can be a part of this society, right? But, so you can check marks. So for me, I'll be like male, Korean ethnicity, pretty boring. Like, yeah, those things, right? Mid-class. So people might look at my document, oh, he's a Korean American, right? But we've been wrestling with this question, what does it mean to be Korean American? What does it mean to be Korean American or Asian American? There's so many different ways, right? We talked about regional differences, how we make sense of our Korean identity differently. We talked about through generations, right? Generationally, we think about our identity differently, right? There are many ways to be Korean American, right? So, for example, undocumented Korean immigrants, like I'm not sure if they would, their sense of identity would be perfectly aligned with how I think about my identity, right? So these so-called subgroups in sociology, right? These or Korean adoptees or interracial Korean Americans, right? So there are many ways to be Korean American, right? So our identity is so complex. It's so complex that it's hard to put in couple words. It's hard to talk about who we are by just checking marks. So our identity is more like this. It's stories. It has plots. It doesn't have only one story, but it has many stories, right? You might know me as a church member or a professor or a friend, right? But there are many identities in me that you do not know about, right? Maybe my parents know, but not some other people, right? So identities like stories, right? And stories are always changing too. There's only one episode, there are multiple episodes, right? So for me, as I wrestle with my identity for my entire life, right? I find this narrative theories to think about my identity very helpful because I'm so much more than just I am Korean American cisgender male, right? Because I have many stories that are much like Korean American, but that is uniquely me, right? The stories that only I have, or only what I'm wrestling with. So this, even in theological education, does anyone remember this? The living human document, right? So we've been trying to, human beings are like stories, right? Living human stories, and we are constantly making sense of who we are. So narrative identity, once again, right? We are the stories we tell. So narrative is our identity, 정체성. 이야기가 곧 우리의 정체성이라는 거죠. 정체성이라는 것은 그냥 몇 단어로 이렇게 얘기할 수 있는 것이 아니고 이야기처럼 더 포괄적이고 더 다양함을 가지고 있을 수 있고 또 이야기는 변할 수 있거든요. 변할 수 있고 재해석될 수 있기 때문에 정체성을 이야기로 생각해 볼 수 있는 거를 narrative identity라고 합니다. Also, we are storytelling beings by nature, right? So neuroscientists have discovered that we learn things quickly through stories. And our brains are wired for storytelling. So we remember things better when we learn things from stories, right? Also, narrative makes our lives rich and meaningful, right? Stories gives us meaning, right? Not to pick on my colleague here, but by identifying myself, by relating to the character of Barnabas, I claim that I'm a person of encouragement, right? I'm a person who cares about people, right? So when you have stories, when you have multiple stories, good stories, it makes your life rich and meaningful, right? That's how you make meanings out of your life. And also narrative is a self-interpretation. Narrative is an interpretation. It's how you interpret life. 삶은 해석이다라고 얘기합니다. 그렇죠? 왜냐하면 우리의 삶이 이야기이기 때문에 우리가 해석하는 것이 결국 나의 정체성이라는 것이죠. 그래서 해석이 바뀔 수도 있죠. 그렇죠? 해석이 바뀔 수도 있기 때문에 내 정체성도 어느 곳에 있느냐에 따라 변할 수 있는 것이라는 것을 말해주고 한국말로 더 잘 되네요 오늘. 네, so narrative is an active self-interpretations, right? So we tell stories to entertain, educate, inspire, persuade, and motivate, but above all, they make sense of our lives. So we tell stories because we want to understand our lives. We want to understand why that event happened to me, why that particular event happened in my life. Why did God allow me to go through particular experience in my life? So the human way of responding to those events, episodes in life is that so that we're trying to tell stories, we're trying to make sense of things, we're trying to connect all the dots. That's why we do storytelling. And also narrative is not only individually created, but also collectively shaped by various stories from families, school, churches, and larger cultures, right? Culture, we talked about cultural narratives, right? Because here you in these particular, we call narrative environments, in this narrative environment, you find your conversation partners. So, do you know when people first learn storytelling? Do you know where they learn first? In their house. Yeah. And who teach children how to tell stories? Oftentimes, not all the time, oftentimes mothers, parents, right? So more stories the parents tell them, children learn that's how you make sense of life. Like when your parents tell you things, right? Oh, this is what they do when they experience something. They're trying to make sense of their lives, right? So the adult caregivers, oftentimes parents are the ones that teach their children how to tell stories. And also not also family, but also schools, but churches, right? In churches, through sermons or through Bible studies and fellowship and discussions, we engage different stories, right? So more stories, because this identity development happens in adolescence, right? Youth, young people, they are the ones that they wrestle with the question, who am I, right? So they are really keen on how to tell their story. They don't know that, right? But that's going through their mind. Like they're trying to, who am I? What are my stories, right? So oftentimes family, school, and churches and these larger cultures are the sources of these stories, right? This is where people engage different stories and they may borrow some of them and they may internalize some of them. Also, they can reject and resist some of them, right? So that's what they go through, identity crisis, right? Not crisis. And in psychology, crisis means exploration. It's not a bad thing. It's an exploration. So identity crisis, identity exploration through storytelling. So to sum up about our narrative theory, stories are about the vicissitudes of human intention organized as a plot in time. What characters want, what they intend to do, and how over time they go about trying to get what they want or avoid what they do not want. 우리의 이야기들은 줄거리로 짜여진 인간의 우여곡절에 관한 것입니다. 이야기들은 우리가 삶을 어떻게 살아왔는지 그리고 어떻게 앞으로 살아갈 것인지를 알려주는 것입니다. So storytelling begins, right? How does storytelling begin? Storytelling begins with the ability to recall significant events from the past. in order to link remembered past events to imagined future, right? So we talked about that this morning in our panel discussion, right? So storytelling begins with our past, right? That's why we spent yesterday and today learning about the past, even the past that we did not know about, right? Because we cannot create stories out of nothing. We need ingredients. We need characters. We need episodes. Like we need multiple characters, right? To create and make sense of, imagine your life, right? And that begins with your past. So this is a narrative temporal structure. It's not too confusing, right? So here, you begin from the present, your present moment, right? So number one, you go back to your past, right? You think about your memory. Like what happened to me? How did that happen to me, right? So reflecting on the past first, and then you come back to present and understand how your past informs your present moment. And then it doesn't only stop there, but that remembered past and informed present that also informs your future. So in storytelling, right, when we say stories, stories always have temporal structure. Past, present, and future. It always begins with the past. So that's why we're here to learn history, right? This history is so important because that's how we begin good and healthy storytelling. But one thing, we talked, trauma came up here and there, right? When trauma happens, what happened to trauma is that we cannot make sense of that particular traumatic past, right? So that means that what happened to you in the past that was very traumatic, you are not able to make sense of it, right? Until you make sense of that traumatic past, there's no continuity happening, right? Because past, present, and future, that's how narrative works, right? But if you're dealing with particular traumatic past, whether it's personal or communal, that storytelling is entirely difficult. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is my argument. First part in the storytelling. So without knowing our personal and communal histories or stories and understanding their significances and meanings, right? That's what story does. Stories are just not about what happened, but it's about what that means to me, right? Like what that means to my community and my church, right? So knowing our personal and communal histories and understanding their significances and meaning, we have no resources and ability to imagine our future stories of hope. Right? In Korean societies, there's this saying called 역사를 잊은 민족에게는 미래는 없다. 난 여러분 들어보셨죠? 아무리 찾아봐도 누가 했는지 알 수가 없더라고요. So that means what I said was like there's no future for those who have forgotten the past, right? Same thing, right? So without knowing your history, there's no future. You don't know how you are going to live on, right? So that's a narrative theories, and that's why storytelling is so important. So the second part is why do we need to unlock? Why do we do this, right? Why do we need to unlock the stories from the past so that we can imagine a better future, right? Like we hear this a lot in churches. Like we need to know the past, right? We need to remember the past so that we can go on, right? Because I think pretty simple for Christians, this is God's command. This is simply as God's command, right? In Deuteronomy 8:2, God says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the ways in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands, right? Remember, right? And you know that in Old Testament, that verb remember comes up a lot. God cares about remember. God wants us to remember. And later, Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. So remember is a faithful practice, faithful act. But here, actually, in Exodus story, God gives particular reasons why we have to remember God's stories. It's because Exodus chapter 13-14, it says, when in the future your child asks you, what does this mean? you shall answer, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. Exodus 13:8. You shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12, 26 to 27. And when your children ask you, what does this observance mean to you? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our houses, and the people bowed down and worshipped. So God says, remember your past. Remember what I did to you. Remember what I did to your community. Because there are many reasons, right? But most important, because your children will ask. Your children will ask. Your children, your grandchildren, the children in our church will ask you, how did God move in your life? How did God, through 70 years of history, how did God shape this community, this church? Right, you know what, they don't really ask, right? There are many pastors here, we work with young people, like they don't really ask, right? Like, oh yeah, what's the history of the church, right? So it's hard to imagine that part, but inside of them, they're yearning for knowing more about their history, especially the second and third gens. They don't ask out loud, verbally, can you tell me the story? Obviously not in that way. But as they wrestle with their identity formation, they're yearning for knowing more about where he or she or they came from. They're yearning to know more about where their parents came from. Why did they come to America? Was it the war? Was it there are many reasons for immigration, right? So God says, you have to remember where you came from because your children will ask. So how do we tell, right? This is the ultimate, not the ultimate question, but this is a really important task. So how do we tell and pass down our stories from generation to generation? Well, that's what we've been doing, right? Like we learned part of important Korean history yesterday, and this morning and today we learned Korean American history that many of us didn't have a chance to learn, right? And I encourage you to, when you continue thinking about his histories, right? I ask you to consider them as church history, right? That was my conviction, right? Like this is not just diplomatic history, or this is not about the Jeju-won drama, but this is church history. It's about history of God's people messing things up, right? Screwing things up, but finding ways to follow God in their own faithful ways, right? That's a theological imagination, right? Those are church history, right? So we've been learning this history. So how do we pass down our stories from generation to generation? So how can we tell our children? How can we tell our children our stories? How do we make sure that they remember these stories so that, one, we can answer them when we ask for it, but also so that they can tell their own children after, right? Children after, future generations, we remember how God has been leading not only this church, but the entire Korean American churches, right? How do we do that? So I struggle a lot with this question, like, what should I do? This is like the last part. And then I have a student at School of Theology, and she's actually a Jewish American. So, and we had an Easter, right? The Easter's very big in School of Theology for sure. So we were like, oh, this is Easter, very important. And then there's my student and came up and said, oh, Dr. Cho, this is also Passover. And we got this conversation, and then she was telling me about I didn't really ask, what do you guys do? But then she really got excited and tell me about this is what we do in Passover. So, and I was hearing, it got really longer than I expected, right? So I learned kind of the Passover 101 for Jewish American communities, right? And then there's something that she told me, a lot of things that she told me that kind of reminded of how I grew up, or something similar to what Korean immigrant churches do. So you guys know Passover, right? Passover, this is, just to give you an idea of, this is the map of the Jewish diaspora, right? Jewish diaspora means dispersion, right? So we didn't really use the word diaspora here a lot, but we are also Korean diaspora, or we are diaspora, we're scattered people, right? So I was like, oh, like how do Jewish community in diaspora, how do they do storytelling? So that kind of became my question. How do they observe Passover? So I'm going to talk about particular practice, storytelling practice that Jewish communities in diaspora do in Passover, and that would be our kind of main way of thinking about how do we go forward. So we know the importance of storytelling, right? The storytelling has to be from generation to generation, because that's God's command, right? And also God wants us to be ready for telling those stories, because our children will ask, right? So I was like, so how do Jewish communities do storytelling? So in the Passover, so they use this book called Haggadah. Right? So Haggadah which means telling, or telling stories, right? Haggadah is in Hebrew is a written guide, like a guidebook to the Passover Seder, right? So Seder is like the Passover feast, right? It's like the biggest feast they do in Passover, right? And Haggadah is like a guidebook, right? It's like kind of a 생명의 삶 kind of thing, right? It's like a guidebook they use. Guidebook they use to do their feast, right? Because their feast is a ritual. It's kind of like a worship. It's kind of 가정 예배 같은 거 같아요. So they use this book to really observe this feast event every Passover when it comes. So Haggadah means telling, right? And there are many versions of Haggadah written and developed in various Jewish diaspora communities throughout the world, right? So the red one is the Haggadah for the Chinese Jews. So Haggadah is everywhere, right? And then each Haggadah stories and the guideline, it was like developed in particular context, right? So how Chinese Jews, crazy, right? How Chinese Jews observed Passover, and particular this Haggadah telling of the story practice, slightly different from how Jewish American communities do that here, right? So Haggadah is like everywhere. It's kind of like the small Bible. Using Christian terms, it's not enough. Yeah, it's a maybe easier way to think about it. So they do this Haggadah. So what do they do what do they do in Seder, this Passover feast, by using Haggadah? How do they engage storytelling? First, what they do is they reenact the Exodus story, right? I don't have to explain that, why God ordered Israelites to observe Passover, right? So when they're about to have this feast, what they do is they retell the Exodus story. They know that. They know the Exodus story, but they still retell them, reenact them. Exodus 13:8, that verse shows up in every Haggadah article I read past 2 weeks. This is the guiding verse. Exodus 13:8, you shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So imagine Seder as like a 설날, like a New Year's feast you're having, right? And they all gather together like this, and then they're all holding Haggadah book, right? And they're reading that together. Haggadah is like it's like a guidebook, right? So what they do is they retell the Exodus story. They remember the story. They remember the story of how their ancestors were brought out, like how God has brought us to freedom as a nation. Right? So they retell the story. So this is definitely a family experience. Like family get together and they read Exodus together. And also in Jewish American communities, they do that in a more creative ways, right? So they do role play. So they do like theatrical reading of Exodus. So like, Appa, you play Pharaoh, like Mom, you play Miriam or something, you know. So they do this acting together. So they're just not reading the text, but they're actually living it out, kind of having fun, right? So they're reenacting the Exodus story. And then they discuss what freedom means. What freedom means back to their ancestors, but also to their diaspora community. And another thing that was so fascinating is that throughout the history of Jewish diaspora, they re-engage Exodus story to remember their God of freedom in the midst of pain and loss in their diaspora context. So in the time of Holocaust, they found their makeshift ways to do Passover, and they created this pseudo makeshift feast table. They still read Exodus story in the time of Holocaust. Also, wherever anti-Semitism is, which means anti-Jewishness movement, wherever in many parts of the world, they would hold on to this Exodus story to remember that even though what we are facing is very challenging, but we believe in God who saved, who gave freedom to our ancestors. And also when they discuss these things with their parents and children, in conversation in Exodus story, they discuss contemporary issues. I thought this was fascinating. So they're not only talking about slavery in the time of Exodus, but they're talking about modern day slavery. They're talking about the issue of Holocaust, racism. I asked my Jewish friend, 2 of them, that whether they do this, or is this academicians writing something cool? Like, do you guys actually do that? And they said yes. So question goes like this, and the parents say, so what does this story mean to you today? How does God speak to you? How is Exodus story relevant to you today in America? And then they engage in contemporary issues. So also they remember by eating, right? So I'm not gonna go over what food they eat, right? You can always look up and learn. But so in Seder, in Korean Seder, in Seder they engage symbolic foods ritual by breaking, dipping, indicating, and hiding them, so that the Haggadah tells you what to do, like in order, like, and also they know why we eat these herbs, why they eat matzah, why they eat certain things, why they drink wine, why they have to dip vegetable twice, right? So they learn all these things, which is, to me, is a storytelling, right? Because story always goes with that when they eat something, right? To me, this is like embodied way of storytelling, right? Storytelling is not always, when we say storytelling, it's a verbal, right? It's written. But here in Seder, they tell stories by eating. Third, they encourage children's participation. So one part of the Seder event at the end is that the youngest child in that table, right? They get to ask 4 questions to the parents, right? This is why the children will ask. So whoever is the youngest in that table, 제일 어린 아기가, 학생이, they get to ask 4 questions. It's a pre-written questions, actually. So they ask 4 questions to their parents and their grandparents, and then they respond to these questions, and they also tell stories as well. So these 4 questions: why on this night do we eat matzah? Why on this night do we eat bitter herbs? Why on this night do we dip twice? Why on this night do we eat while reclining? So it's the children, they get to have a mic. They get to have a mic, and they get to ask questions to their parents, right? To me, that was fascinating. Wow. And they get to kind of lead this event, this storytelling time. They get to ask questions, and then they're free to ask additional questions to that. So why do we, why on this night do we eat matzah? Because our ancestors could not wait for their breads to rise when they were fleeing slavery in Egypt, right? So this is the end. So what does this all mean, right? So we learn about storytelling, why stories are important to us, and why do we need to engage in storytelling from generation to generations, and what does this mean for us? What does this mean for Korean immigrant churches? How can we tell our stories from generation to generation to imagine a better future? Once again, you're already doing it. Because I think Haggadah reminds me of the lunch fellowship that we do in churches. Haggadah reminds me of 가정 예배, the family worship that a lot of Korean Christians do, right? But Haggadah to me seems like a more intentional way of telling the story of Exodus in a way that their future generations, their children and grandchildren can remember, not only by listening and reading, but also eating, enacting, singing, and just having that interaction with their family members. So what does that mean for all of us? So one, you're already doing it. So what I'm suggesting to you is help you to think more about what does this would look like in your church context. So one, we have to help our children and young people to learn our histories. I don't have to say more to that. Korean history, Korean American history, Asian American history. And as I said in this morning, because our public school will not teach these things. So I really think that, to me, really think that it has to be Sunday school teachers and the pastors who teach this history. And as I mentioned, the Korean language school, 한글학교. I think 한글학교 can really take on this ministry of teaching our children the important history that they will not learn in school. And also this means that you have to know your local history. Right? We're here to celebrate the 70-year anniversary of Boston KCB, right? But I hope that wherever you are, I hope you will have a chance to revisit the local, not only your church history, but the local area, right? Because, I'm learning a lot about Brookline, too, this historically Jewish neighborhood. And what does it mean to be here in Brookline as an immigrant church, right? So I hope that you will get to know your own local history, wherever you're, whether it's Atlanta, New Jersey, and tell our members what that is. Second, more contextual reading and engagement of the stories from the Bible. I dreaded saying this because I recognize that there are a lot of theological spectrum in this room. And Bible, how to interpret Bible, is such a sensitive subject. And we always end up fighting. What's the right way to engage Bible? But what I want to encourage you, this is just like Haggadah. I think, especially for young people, younger generation, they really yearn to know what that story of Exodus mean to them in their own context. What the story of Esther, how does that speak to them today? Yes, back in the days, but also travel time. What does that mean to me today? What does it mean to our church? So that their text and their context can be integrated. I think that's what we need to do. 3, more embodied and experiential ways of telling stories. So my often critique for Korean immigrant church Christian education is that we're very text-based. We do a lot of curriculum, 공가 공부, we do a lot of reading, right? That's great, right? That's a Confucian spirit. We learn to read and write and learn languages, right? But I also think that there can be, the education and also telling stories can be more embodied and experiential, because that's what they remember. When they eat that herb, that bitter herb, they will remember why they ate that with their parents. And that will also transfer them back to the actual Exodus history. Because food and memories, they go hand in hand, right? So So I had a chance to take 25 college students from America to Korea to their homeland visit. This is the program that our PCUSA does for over 30 years. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk with you more about this. But this is a trip that I led twice to take our second-gen Korean American students to visit Korea. And there I went to Yanghwajin and all the places that Dr. Chan mentioned. So for these second and third gens to visit their homeland through the Christian lens, it's not perfect. I'll say it's not perfect, but it becomes a pilgrimage. Also, it becomes a journey of finding more about their identity. So I think whether that's field trips or trips, mission trips, of course, but also more related to helping them to learn more about their transnational history and connection, this kind of work is essential. Number 4, enable our children and young people to tell their stories in the church. What I mean by this, really center them, right? Like Haggadah, the youngest children get to have a microphone and they get to ask questions. Like, do we do that in our church, in your church? Do we create spaces for our young children to play around? It's tough, right? It's messy. And every church has their own struggles, right? But if we say we care about the future generations, but are we creating spaces for them to, tell their stories and for them to exercise leadership? Or are they just have to meet 1:30 because 11 a.m. the Korean congregation has to meet? I'm not here to criticize them, but really, I'm not here to criticize them, but that's the reality. And when those things happen, second and third gen children would think they know they are not the most important priority. So while we listen to the needs of every generation, but if your church finds this work, this telling stories, important part of your church, then are we doing that? Are we doing that work? So this is a part of my research. So my first book is on my kind of ethnographic research and participant observation work with Korean American dreamers, undocumented immigrants. And some of them were my actual students in my youth group. And so this is 이민자 보호교회, Korean American Sanctuary Church Network. I think some of you here know about this. So I partnered with them because I wanted to get to know some of those DACA recipients. And then, so in 2019, I traveled to New York to I was in Atlanta to be a part of their conferences and their events. And this exhibition was, so they did art exhibition where these undocumented Korean Christians, youth and young adults, they tell their stories through arts. So they submit this artwork, and some of them submit their stories, and then we had a really lovely exhibition like what we are doing right now. And then we give them prizes. I'm one of them over there. It's a pre-pandemic. I look very different. But this is a one-way, not just the second gen and third gen, future gen, but especially the undocumented youth and young adults who have to navigate more challenges in Korean church context, for them to tell their stories more intentionally. And to me, I really love their work because they're really intentional and big on that, creating that space for this particular group of people. Lastly, empowering them to connect with the larger communities in North America. So helping them to, I'll end with this Atlanta. So I'm from Atlanta, it's my home. And so when Atlanta, it's kind of like 사이구, right? It gets emotional because Atlanta is my home. So in the midst of anti-Asian racism and when the shooting took place in Atlanta, actually I was in Texas, but my parents are in Atlanta, so I called them. 엄마가 둘루스에 있으라고. Just stay in Koreatown. Don't go out there. Stay in Koreatown. And when this happened, of course, a lot of trauma. We don't have to go through that. But what was so beautiful was that how many people, right, not just Korean or Asian American individuals and communities, but actually larger, right, like not only Korean but Japanese and Chinese, also beyond East Asian American individuals and communities gathered here, and just really. We did a lot of prayer vigils. Also, we had a lot of worship. Actually, a lot of Christians were part of this, So it was such a beautiful way for us to know that, yeah, it's so sad that a tragedy happens and we respond. It's always like that, sadly. But what was so beautiful and important to me about this whole experience was that, yeah, we gathered to really pray for the victims and their families, but also really pray for our community. And also, this was one of those moments where, like, a lot of my friends were involved, and I was there too. And we got to experience, oh yeah, we are part of larger American community. Yeah, it's so easy to be in the Gwinnett County or Bergen County, right? It's easy to be in that LAK town, right? That's our comfort zone, rightly so. But in moments like this, I was reminded that, wow, I was a part of a larger Asian American community. And this weekend, so after this event, there is this new coalition emerged called Asian American Christian Network of Atlanta. So we're having another event. It's our third event since the shooting, and so just called Remember and Renew. A lot of my friends are involved, so this time I'm trying to go there and be a part of this event where we talk about how that incident has shaped us and shaped our stories and also shaped our whole experience. So I really pray that this kind of initiative and coalition would last longer. And me not only as a scholar, but also as a pastor, to me, that's my calling, to be there, to show up, but also to provide resources for them. So that was a lot. So I want to invite you to take just 1 minute on your own. So one day in the future, your children will ask. Your children, your grandchildren will ask, what was your faith journey? 수일 뒤에 너의 자녀들이 묻거든. Your children will ask your story, your stories of immigration, your stories of encountering God, your stories of your community, your stories of pain and loss and redemption, your stories of building up immigrant church. Not just the community, but actual building of the church. Your children will ask. And may I ask, are you ready to tell those stories to your children? Are you prepared? Have you done enough reflection? Have you read? Have you learned some histories to think about who you are and who you are becoming? Are we ready as a church to this storytelling for our future generation? Let's take 1 minute of reflection and silence for everyone to kind of gather some things together. I'm going to wipe my tears a little bit, and then we'll come back. So let's take 1 minute as we come to close. Take 1 minute. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we have some time for questions. I think we have time for questions. We have about, I think, 10 minutes. So Q&A, questions, or feedback, comments. Yeah.
Professor Cho, thank you so much for your lecture. I really appreciated the narrative identity approach. I love the prescriptions. And I'm thinking, I'm David Chow. I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity at Princeton Seminary. So, my apologies. David Chow, David Cho. Number one prescription was to better understand Korean history, Korean American history, and Asian American history. So I'm going to try to frame my comment in the form of a question. What obligation do our seminaries and theological curriculum have to teach Asian American church history? Typically in seminaries that are forming the church leaders that you want to do point number one,
Right.
When they sit in a church history class, they learn more about Calvin's Geneva and the number of infant baptisms of a certain decade from the consistory archival records than they do of any church in U.S., any Asian church in the U.S. context. So the question would be, what is the obligation that our seminaries and our denominations have for creating a structure of education where we are equipped with self-history, histories of our own churches, and do you see, are you hopeful for a pathway for our theological curriculum? I'm just curious as one theological educator to another.
Thank you, David. First of all, thank you so much for the center you're directing. By the way, there's an Asian American Theology Ministry Conference at PTS soon. So, and I think Jane, you're going to. Yes, so it's coming this week, so please don't miss that. I've been such a, so like I wish every seminary has that kind of resource. Just want to thank you so much for doing that. So just, because part of what we need to do is just to bring our stories to greater awareness, right? The more public awareness. So, one, I want to just to honor and remember that there are people like you and Sujin Pak. There are people in theological educations who are doing that work. Although we face a lot of challenges. We face a lot of challenges, but we're doing that on our own, right? So we're going through curriculum review this fall. So this will be important conversation. But yeah, we know that a lot of not only Korean, but also Asian American, or even Native American, our seminarians of color do not feel seen in their syllabus. And also there are a lot of hierarchies too, like, we love Calvin, right? We love Calvin and Wesley. And that's like systematic theology, and like practical theology is like downstairs, like area 4, right? Like that's not at my school. I'm very well treated. Yeah, not at PTSB. We do great. So there are a lot of larger cultures that make that work very difficult. I think for me, and that's many of our experiences. So I think just thinking more micro level in my classroom, I try to make sure that like what readings to be included and what articles and such. I always try to make sure that not everybody, but I try to make sure that people come to my class feel a little bit of that feeling of sense of belonging. Or this professor cares something about my community. And I'm thinking in more micro level, David, like, and I say to my students that I do my best to be inclusive and address all of your needs, but I'm very limited. I don't know much, I'm still learning. So would you help me? Would you suggest more readings? Like, what am I forgetting? And I think, so that kind of interaction for me. And I hope that will be the experience of a lot of Korean and Asian American seminarians too, like whether they get to, really engage literature, engage theology, that really matters to them. So, and also I think Obligations, I think so, but I think that's a many, that'll take a lot of work, but I'm thinking, what can I do as a instructor who teaches a course, who get to teach students, all students. And so I think for me, like being transparent and honest about like my struggle and naming this struggle, I think that's the first step for our theological educators. And also, I think we need to help one another, because we cannot address all the issues. So I think, so for me to like share those kind of links, like PTS is having great events on this, right? Or Candler or BU is having this great events on that. So while it's a lot of work for BIPOC students to navigate theological education, but I think for us having this kind of conversation, and so how can we help them and accompany them to navigate this space little with more ease and with more support? Yeah.
I would encourage churches
Yeah.
to say to their denomination, so I'm thinking of NCKPC, you have authority to say within the PCUSA denominational structure, we need our churches to be taught in our Presbyterian schools.
Yeah.
If you make that, keep saying it. I think you need to use the polity structure of the denominations to your advantage, so that your stories are taught for your pastors that are being trained.
Yeah.
So I would really encourage the Korean leadership at the national level,
Yeah.
through polities such as NCKPC,
Yeah.
to formally request of the Presbyterian schools
Yeah.
that I am part of, that your stories need to be visible in the curriculum.
Yeah.
That's a specific, or else we can't do number one,
Right.
which is to know our stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I get excited about
Thank you,
this.
thank you. Yeah, yeah. And I think even before that, I think we need to do some self-examination why we have not been so determined to fight for that. Maybe that says something about who we are, how we've been trained, right? So, thank you.
I think this is more of a response and then a comment, or maybe a reaction. So you don't have to really answer right now, and then we can talk later. And then it's also related to what David Chow said. So as a pastor theologian who's working for the denominational office, like I find this very encouraging, like coming from a character like you, like a Barnabas. But at the same time, okay, that's the part of my positive response, not to lose my job. And then the second, another part as a religion, maybe a scholar, and then a human, and maybe this is relevant to the curriculum question as well. There is so much disconnection between the stories, the Bible stories, the Luther Calvin stories, the Reformation histories, and then the Korean American immigration history we just shared, the LA riot, and then the Atlanta, shootings. So different. And Native Americans, yesterday we heard, it's like, as a Christian, and then as a also person of color who was like colonized and imperialized by these Christian nations, like it's sometimes impossible for us to make that connection. And I think it's a huge problem for us to shape our identity and then our authentic voice. And it's just my initial reaction to and then all the things going on this past couple days. And I'm not asking your answer right now. And it's just like, it's a task, huge task we have to do. But then at the same time, it's not just a limitation, it's just overwhelming things to do, coming our ways. But I just want to address that disconnection with real honesty instead of like covering them up.
Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi.
I know that there are a lot of non-New England people here, and it seems like there are very high people here, but I'm the director of Arise Ministries. We're a nonprofit that serves the next generation of the Korean Church of New England.
Okay.
I'm also the second-gen pastor at North Boston and the assistant director of alumni engagement at Gordon Conwell. I'd like to ask a question, not about polity or about the older generation, even amongst the second gen, but about the younger generation, because these are really wonderful things and there are a lot of really important and smart people here. But my concern is with this Gen Z, third generation, 2.5 generation, that I, as a second generation in my later 20s, has no idea how to talk to as an EC youth pastor myself that serves the region and sees all of our youth on a regional level. So my question to you is, the Haggadah is a really compelling framework for retelling stories about the Exodus. And we've been hearing throughout the symposium about the importance of all of that, about what God has done for Korea and about what God has done for the immigrant church.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was contextualized enough outside of the Jewish American context for it to be something that is useful to somebody like me. So what would you say, and what kind of advice would you give to a next generation leader like me about leading the second and the third generation to a place where we can remember how God has been faithful to our people?
Yeah, thank you. That's and maybe that is the question, right? That's the essential question that we're all dealing with. And but humbly, I said that that work of contextualization, right? And I think one, I do not know everything about your context or everyone's context, because every context has different challenges, right? That's something that we've been talking about as well. So I think right now, personally, I think that I hope that we can begin the work of contextualization. One, we've been doing it. I really want to celebrate that. We've been doing this work without naming it. I really want to affirm that, like whether, how do we quantify good ministry? How do we quantify what's good and not? But I think for us to be an immigrant church, stay here, I think that itself is practicing Korean American theology. So I think one, we've been doing it in our own way without naming it. And we're here to think about how do we do this better, right? So I think one practically, I think we want to have a conversation about this, right? And because a lot of us, what I'm hearing from some people is that we all feel very alone and isolated in our own ministry context. And that isolation makes it difficult for us to share with one another. And oftentimes immigrant churches are smaller, and so that network isn't really established in many places. So I think one practical thing we must do is just to create that network and create an intentional community where we can have this conversation. And honestly, I was so humbled this lunchtime, because I was thinking like, oh my God, like how do I sound theologically astute today, But then I was having lunch conversation with a lot of you guys, and you guys were talking about burnouts and isolation, and that really humbled me. Oh wow, like I've been in the academia. The pastors are speaking different languages. So I think for one, it's important for me to know that, not for me know what local pastors are thinking about it, and then but for us to really have this conversation, like, so how do we overcome this isolation? How can we create more communities? And that's something that someone like you and me to begin the work here, because that those questions are real. But I think the contextualizing work of that, I think it really has to be those who are in the context to do it. So I feel careful as a scholar to say, you need to do this because of this, right? But I think but only those who are really immersed in that particular church setting, it has to be their strength. It has to be their stories need to be uplifted, not for someone like a scholar to say, this is a good theology, you should try this. So I just want to empower local leaders to do that work, and I'm here to support anything that I can give. So thank you so much.
Just to say to you, there are other pastors here who are going through the same thing as you. So if you want to stick around today or come tomorrow, we would love to figure that out with you, because I think that's our challenge as well. So there's a lot of pastors in this room as well who understand that question. So yeah.
So mine is, sorry to keep you up here a few more minutes, but a response to a response. And like Sojang, I think this is more like, I think we have to continue this conversation. I thank you for showing that actually our identity is about our stories. And I think for me, that frees me, because identity is not some like single essence we have to explore, discover, or agree upon. So we could have multiple identities, multiple stories. And I think the gospel itself, like you have 4 different stories about Jesus, right? And we do not need to harmonize them. We just let those 4 stories tell those stories of Jesus. And I think authenticity is a tricky word, because it could still be another way of saying essential. Like, what does it mean to be truly a Korean American? It's like us trying to harmonize the 4 stories into a single story. There's Corky Lee's a photographer, Chinese photographer, and he says how that he is, because he's Asian American, he's 100% authentically fake. Right? Because there's so many people trying to force him to be an authentic Chinese American, Asian American, and he doesn't need to accept those narratives. And one other thing about, like, I think what would be great is, like, what if we kind of have part of our stories, right, be part of, this might be controversial, like, be the canon. Like you said, all stories should be considered church history. Our stories are also part of the continuing gospel story, right? So what we consider the New Testament canon, it's really these Gentiles coming in who's part of now the people of God, and they're trying to understand who they are by telling the story. So they don't remove the Jewish story, but they kind of expand the canon. And I do feel like with every people and culture who experience God, we should also expand the canon and consider that our stories are also legitimate ways of expressing God. And what I really appreciated with Ilona is she expanded our canon, right? Again, this morning when she talked about this is Turtle Island and tells us another story about how to relate to Earth. I don't think that's a lesser story. I think that's also a story about God. So,
Thank you. And I think quickly to respond, I think one of the ways that we can expand the canon is to like tell new stories, right? Tell new stories, but also resist those harmful stories, right? Like that authenticity story, right? Like we know who created that authentic criteria, right? Like who created that? Like what does it mean to be like you're so authentic? That's authentic Christian narrative, you know? So I think white supremacy plays an important role. That's the product of it. So I think so we went to name and resist those stories that are life limiting, but create new stories and invite conversational partners to kind of expand that what story can be. Thank you.
Yes, I had one question, and I'd like to, second thing, I'd like to respond to what Dr. Chow was saying. As one of the representative of the NCKPC, which is a national caucus of Korean Presbyterian churches. And Sam just spoke. He knows well the situation, but well, first, my name is Sung Ju. I am executive director of NCKPC and also a pastor of a church in Florida. NCKPC used to be the largest in terms of membership, largest caucus within the PCUSA. Now is the second largest because the Black caucus is a little bit bigger than the NCKPC. Unfortunately, even though we are recognized as a caucus within the PCUSA, unfortunately, NCKPC is not officially recognized as a caucus of PCUSA. And that's something that I just learned recently. And my term is 3 years, and I'm just finishing my first year, and there will be 2 more years. And one of the things that we're gonna try to do is for next GA, which is in 2024 in June, we're gonna try to make it official. But as you know, caucuses are not political by policy. They cannot do any overture. So, but there is a local, regional presbytery that is making this overture. They agreed to do it. So I would like to ask all of you to pray for this event so that we'll become officially recognized as one of the caucus of PCUSA. So we're in response to what you said, we are in no position of saying we don't have much voice right now. But when we become recognized, maybe we're not political, but we can make our voice out of this. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe last one, yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Thank
But,
you.
yeah, thank you. I'm James, but I'm just. If I was in the Bible, I'd be a no-name, person, right? Just a passerby. I serve a very small, predominantly first-gen Korean church in Houston, and so the question I have is, maybe more of a prayer request, is what about the smaller Korean immigrant churches, right? I don't know how many percentage of the churches in the U.S., Korean immigrant churches in the U.S. are small to the point where they're still predominantly first-gen Koreans, either by nature or because the second gens have left the church. Because in many cases, the children are there against their will. They're there because their parents are still there, right? And they're still and always are marginalized. And oftentimes, they either don't have youth pastors, all right, or English-speaking pastors. And if they do, many times they are yuhaksengs, right, who don't understand second gens or Gen Z, as she mentioned, right? And so, and just being here, this was my first time. It's only been 2 years since I moved to Houston from Chicago, and first time in a PCUSA church. And so just seeing this, having these discussions with these pastors and, listening to your lecture, thank you very much, by the way.
Wow, thank you.
It's amazing. Like, but what about the small churches? How do we bring this discourse and these conversation for better future, better tomorrow into the smaller Korean churches that in many ways don't have a medium from this, maybe unless, the NCKPC, like except from the caucus or like the Kyodan, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Ah.
So I see, all these pastors and stuff, and I envy you guys because
Yeah.
you guys are at least having these kind of, these courses and stuff, but, what about those that don't have,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
All those means, and so.
Well, thank you, James. You'll be always welcome to be a part
Oh,
of
yeah,
this.
yeah, thank you so much.
Oh,
Yeah.
or whether you become PCUSA or not, so thank you for that question. That's a tough one, but one thing I'm just reminded of is that when I looked for Korean DACA recipients to join my interview, it was really, really hard. And then, so I ended up interviewing 25 of them, pretty having deep storytelling conversation. And one of the themes that I heard from most all of them is, oh, I thought I was the only Korean DACA recipient. I thought I was the only one, right? So it's kind of like, oh, I thought I was the only pastor struggling. I thought I was the only pastor struggling with that. I thought I'm the only pastor serving a small congregation. So I think that fear definitely exists. So one, we really have to work hard to, that's fear, internal fear as well as the culture. I think the cultural narrative is that there are a lot of things that tells us that we are alone, right? Because, and also Korean, very communal culture that, that communal affirmation matters so much, right? So when you don't see people around you telling, oh yeah, that's right, and then it's really easy for us to get into the isolation. So that means, once again, we go back to better network, but more intentionally, right? And so we often think a lot about how about a big church helping out several smaller churches, right? But there is an issue of power, right? We talked about power. Then maybe it should be 3 small churches get together, right? And then do a joint retreat, right? And do a joint lock-in. Wow, lock-in. Good old days, right? So what about doing those things? So I think one, whether it's us or we need better ways to take care of one another, to make sure we're doing well, to make sure that we're not alone in this journey. And we're talking about how a lot of second-gen pastors are leaving Korean churches, and we bless their journeys, right? But that says something about that they are not being good taken care of. So what can we do to care for one another, the network of care? So that's why event like this is so important that, we can, just build that network of care. So how can we do that? And there's some responsibility I need to play, and I hope that these friendship that we build here will be lasting, will be permanent, not just a one-time event. So I think that's a responsibility for everyone. So thanks for your reminder. Thank you.
Thank you, David, Joe. Thank you very much for providing a practical way forward for our future generation. Tomorrow morning, there will be a group discussion at 9 a.m. I hope we can talk more about the subject the sessions addressed. In closing the sessions, I would like to ask Reverend Eunil, the senior pastor of the Korean Church of Boston, to give us a few words.
Few words, right? Okay, thank you so much. Actually, I would like to recognize a couple of people. Actually, we wanted to have her yesterday, Dr. Sujin Park, Dean of the Divinity School in BU. Please stand. Let's and I would like to recognize one person, the clerk of session of KCB. I cannot see him. Backside. Please stand. Yeah, 장양술 장로님. 장양술 장로님. Yes. Although I and that David told that it was last August that I just bought you food and enticed you to kosher, whatever. However, without our sessions, the final decision, it wouldn't happen, this kind of wonderful stuff. Since David Cho, Dr. Cho, encouraged to say stories, narratives, I like to have very short 2 stories. One is that actually one pastor asked me how I made up the title, 2 Tales of a City Upon a Hill. But I would like to recognize the person who made the subtitle, Unlocking the Path for a Better Future Together. Actually, Elder Ku complained yesterday that he was terrified when he was appointed as the co-moderator, co-chair of the Symposium committee. In November, yes, we met together. Kim Seong Moksanim, Im Moksanim, and 4 of us, and it took 3 hours to convince him, persuade him. And finally he said, maybe, and 2 weeks later, he made up the subtitle. Yeah, he got it, he understood, he digested and what's going on, and he made up that one. Only theologian who has some kind of discipline in terms of theological study and so forth can make that kind of subtitle, but he made up, although he's a dentist. And moreover, he's oral surgeon. So I don't know how in the world oral surgeon can make that kind of subtitle. So the subtitle is far better than the main title. So why don't you give big applause to him? Yes. And by the way, in these days, whenever I look, I just wake up at night and watch a smartphone. There is always some kind of email from Pastor Eunil, sometimes 1 a.m., sometimes 4 a.m. during this kind of symposium era. So she did everything, every hard work on behalf of all of us. So why don't we give big applause to you? And thank you, finally, Dr. David Chao actually spoke in terms of question and response. I wanted to give him some minutes, but we are out of time, so I'm sorry. He is the director of Asian American Christianity at Princeton, right? And thank you for being with us. And you are the only Chinese American. No, you are Chinese Korean American, right? Yeah, that's what I meant. Chinese Korean American. All right. He wants to have very good relationship with NCKPC and Korean constituencies. So why don't we give big applause again to him? Finally, speaking of Dr. David Chao, I'm going to just say that David, you are my friend, all right? Actually, several years ago, I attended one of the 5 very good Asian American Theological Forum led by him, and Jane Hong was there, and Russell Zhang was there. Since I was supposed to prepare one workshop for General Assembly Big Tent representing NCKPC, and I need to learn something. That's why I attended there. And actually, I was surprised that I can find only one local pastor, which is in me. And all others are scholars, professors or, PhD students. One more thing. President came and gone, which means no white. Only yellow or, yep. So what's going on? Although you are doing very good job in terms of, the content, but all the scholars are listening and they are applauding each other. and there's a big barrier that what you are saying is not going over the world to the world. So that's one of the reasons that what I imagined that this kind of symposium. It's all thanks to you and Princeton. But what I hope is that this kind of legacy be continued. I don't know, legacy should be continued not only in KCB, but also in NCKPC and beyond. Chinese, okay. So that is my hope and my prayer. And this is, and I'm so excited to have all of you, and not only yesterday, but also today. It's amazing. I just imagine that we have only half of people than yesterday. But also today we are full of you, which means you made this event great. Thank you to all of you. Thank you. We're going to have a photo time. The lecturers and the committee member and whoever wants to have photo with our great lecturers, you may join us. All right? Thank you so much.